Hello there, dear listener. Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. I'm so glad you've chosen to join me on this journey back in time to explore the wild world of medieval pastimes and entertainment. Wherever in the world you happen to be right now, whether it's morning, afternoon, evening, or the witching hour, I invite you to make yourself comfortable, let your cares melt away, and allow my words to paint vivid pictures in your mind's eye. As you settle in, I'd love to know where on this big blue marble you're tuning in from, and what time of day it is in your little corner of the globe. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy calm, quirky storytelling that brings history to life in an immersive way, I humbly invite you to subscribe so you never miss one of our soporific sojourns into the past. But you needn't trouble yourself with any of that right now. The only thing you need to do is relax, breathe deep, and let me gently transport you to a time long ago when life was very different than it is today. A time of castles and kings, peasants and plagues, chivalry and superstition. A time we call the Middle Ages. When most people think of the medieval period, they often conjure up images of hardship and drudgery. And it's true, life was no picnic for the vast majority of people during this era, which roughly spanned from the 5th to the 15th century. It was a feudal society where a small noble class ruled over a large peasant population. For the average serf toiling in the fields, or the apprentice plying his trade, each day was a struggle for survival. But even in the face of war, disease, oppression, and backbreaking labour, the human spirit endures. And medieval folks, just like people in every age, found ways to cope with their lot in life and escape, however briefly, into the realms of joy, revelry, and entertainment. Some of their diversions would seem rather familiar to us, while others range from utterly bizarre to the downright dangerous. So come, let us leave the 21st century behind for a while and discover the wild ways that lords and ladies, knights and knaves, jesters and maidens tried to inject some fun into their hard-scrabble lives. It's a journey that will take us from the majestic tournament grounds to the raucous banquet halls, from the misty forests to the muddy fairgrounds. As we explore these bygone amusements, we'll meet an eccentric cast of characters, some heroic, some villainous, and many just trying to get by in a world very different from our own. We'll witness the chivalrous deeds of the greatest knight who ever lived, learn the secrets of a master chef who set the standard for all French cuisine, and mourn the tragic fate of a minstrel turned martyr. Through it all, we'll gain a deeper understanding of the medieval mindset and marvel at the ingenuity and resilience of people who found light in the darkness, laughter in adversity, and merriment in the midst of misery. So blow out that candle, fluff up that pillow, and let's journey back to a time when fun was hard won, but all the more precious because of it. One of the grandest and most iconic forms of medieval entertainment was the tournament. These elaborate martial competitions were a way for knights to showcase their combat prowess, impress the noble ladies, and climb the social ladder. But beyond that, they were hugely anticipated events that offered a splash of colour, excitement, and pageantry for people of all classes. Tournaments typically took place on large fields outside of towns and lasted for several days. Imagine the scene. Rows of colourful tents and pavilions housing the competing knights and their retinues. Banners and flags bearing coats of arms fluttering in the breeze. Vendors hawking refreshments and souvenirs to the gathered crowds. The air crackling with anticipation and the clamour of people, horses and armour. The stars of the show, of course, were the knights themselves, the medieval equivalent of professional athletes and celebrities. Clad in gleaming armour, adorned with colourful silks, they put on quite the spectacle as they paraded around the arena on their majestic war horses. One knight stood head and shoulders above the rest, both in renown and tournament prowess. His name was William Marshall, and his story is straight out of a storybook. Born the younger son of a minor noble in 1146, Marshall was effectively an extra mouth to feed. So his father did what many nobles did with their surplus sons in those days. He essentially donated young William to the church as an oblate. But the rowdy Marshall was not cut out for the contemplative life. As a youth, he was more interested in brawling than praying. Lucky for him, his talents caught the eye of an influential nobleman who decided to train him as a knight. It proved a most fortuitous decision. Marshall took to the knightly arts like a fish to water. But what truly allowed him to make his mark was his daring do on the tourney circuit. In an era when nobles often had to pay huge ransoms if they were defeated in battle or captured, the money that could be won at tournaments offered an attractive alternative. And William Marshall was very, very good at winning tournaments. Contemporary accounts claim he emerged victorious from an astonishing 500 jousts. That's quite the win record, even if it might be exaggerated. But there's no doubt Marshall was the Michael Jordan of the medieval tourney world, a figure of reverence and renown, a one-man spectacle who drew huge crowds whenever and wherever he competed. His success in the arena translated to success at court. Over his long life, Marshall would serve as a right-hand man to no less than 5 English kings, most notably Richard the Lionheart and his brother John. He remained a paragon of loyalty and wisdom through reigns and rebellions, intrigue and outright war. By the time he died in 1219, he'd risen from humble origins to become one of the most powerful and respected men in the realm, the Earl of Pembroke and Lord Protector of the young King Henry III. But let's get back to those tournaments, because that's where Marshall first made his name. A tournament was a much more raucous and chaotic affair than the sanitized, Renaissance fair jousts we're used to seeing today. In fact, the original tournaments were essentially mock battles, free-for-alls, where large groups of knights clashed in an effort to capture each other for ransom. As you might imagine, these early contests often devolved into very real and dangerous brawls, especially when rivalries and tempers ran hot. The melees could result in severe injuries and even deaths, to the point where the Vatican tried to ban tournaments altogether as needlessly risky to life and limb. Those edicts were largely ignored, of course, but they did spur the nobility to make an effort to impose rules and rein in the bloodshed. By Marshall's time in the late 12th century, tournaments had evolved into somewhat more structured and controlled events, while still retaining an element of risk and unpredictability that kept spectators on the edges of their seats. The individual joust emerged as the main event, with knights going head-to-head in an effort to unseat each other with lance and shield. Even then, serious injuries were common. Marshall himself was said to have been pierced clean through the thigh by a lance during one joust. But for the most skilled and cunning knights, the risks were worth the potential rewards of ransom money, a champion's share of the prize purse, valuable war horses and armor, and the favor of a delighted noble patron. To really get a sense of what these tournaments were like at the height of their cultural dominance, let's zoom in on one especially famous, or perhaps infamous, competition that took place in 1274. The setting was the northern French region of Chalons, and the key players were the brash English Prince Edward, who would later be crowned King Edward I, and the Count of Chalons, a French nobleman. According to one contemporary account, the trouble started when Edward showed up at the tournament grounds with an entourage of no less than 200 knights. The sheer size of his retinue was seen as an arrogant power move by the French hosts, who were used to being the big cheeses at their own tournaments. The Count of Chalons took particular umbrage at the perceived slight. Things came to a head on the tourney pitch in front of a crowd of thousands. One of Edward's men emerged victorious in his joust against the Count's son, which must have really rankled the French lord. Heated words were exchanged. and before anyone quite knew what was happening, the Count of Chalon charged at the prince himself. Lance lowered. Bad move. Edward deftly dodged the blow and quickly got the better of his hot-headed attacker. According to one witness, the prince grabbed the count around the neck, threw him off his horse into the mud, and struck him with his fist between the shoulders, so that the noise of the blow was heard by those standing far off. Talk about a royal rumble. The humiliated count skulked off to lick his wounds, while Edward basked in the cheers of the crowd. It was the kind of dramatic confrontation and astonishing feat of arms that made tournaments such electrifying spectacles. Of course, once the adrenaline rush wore off, there was still the pesky matter of politics to deal with. The French king, who was the uncle of both Edward and the Count of Chalons, was none too pleased by the diplomatic incident on his doorstep. It took some delicate manoeuvring to smooth over ruffled royal feathers and keep the peace between England and France, at least for the time being. Incidents like this just go to show how tournaments, beyond being rip-roaring entertainments, were also mirrors of the political feuds and power plays of medieval society. They may have been mock battles, but the rivalries and ambitions behind them were very real indeed. Well, dear listener, I think that's quite enough jousting and jostling for one sitting. We've only just scratched the shining surface of medieval entertainment, and there are so many more marvels and merriments to explore, but those will have to wait for another day. For now, I'll bid you a fond good night and leave you to dream of gallant knights, fluttering banners, and the thunder of hooves across a tourney field. May you find rest, respite, and revelation in the arms of history. Until next time, this is your faithful chronicler of times past, wishing you a peaceful slumber full of only the sweetest medieval fancies. Good night. The huntsman is nothing without his trusty hounds baying at the front. Noble hunting dogs like deerhounds, alaunts and limmers barked and sniffed excitedly, eager to be let loose to chase after whatever unfortunate deer, boar, or hare that crossed their path. Keen-eyed greyhounds flanked the noble riders on their mounts, ready to spring into a sprint as soon as prey was spotted. And of course, the noble hunting party would never leave behind its pack of yapping hounds of all shapes and sizes, despite their tendency to run off chasing scents at the most inconvenient of times. But a noble hunt was not a haphazard affair of frenzied dogs tearing willy-nilly through the forest. There was a careful process, a ritual to it all, and one had to play one's part. The Keepers of the Forest. Yes, that was their actual title, scouted ahead to track the quarry, looking for paw prints and scat to determine where the juiciest stag or tastiest hare might be hiding out. The kennel master and his whips were in charge of the dogs, all trained to respond to different horns and hollers, allegedly, at least. One short note meant the hunt was starting, while a long blow signalled that the quarry was spotted, although it probably all just sounded like noise to the poor creature, about to meet its end on the point of an aristocrat's spear. Once the huntsman unclasped the leashes and the hounds took off like a multicoloured scruffy lightning bolt into the underbrush, the human hunters sprang into action on their steeds. They followed the braying dogs, the huntsman's horn, and the keepers crashing through the forest ahead of them, chasing down their prey with a whooping and hollering that surely sent every deer in a 10-mile radius running for the hills. With any luck, the hounds would corner the stag, boar, or whatever poor creature they were hunting, holding it at bay while the noble lord or lady delivered the coup de grâce with a thrust of their lance or a well-aimed arrow. And with a final yelp, the chase was complete, and the noble hunters posed with their prize for a very medieval version of an Instagram post. After a long day of thundering through the woods and ending the lives of a few hapless animals, one worked up quite an appetite. Luckily, the hunting party would return to a feast laid out on trestles in colourful silk tents bedecked with flags and banners. A much-needed respite after an exhausting day. Servants and pages scurried to and fro, bearing goblets and trenchers piled high with roasted meats, pottages and dainty morsels to revive the tired hunters. The hounds that ran down the quarry got the heart and entrails as a reward, while their noble owners received the choicest cuts to savour. Not exactly the type of doggy bag you'd find at a modern restaurant, but I'm sure the poochers weren't complaining. At last, with a final triumphant blow of the bugle, the noble hunters called it a day. The dogs were kennelled, the horses unsaddled, and the unbloodied carcasses hauled back to the castle kitchens for the cooks to deal with. The aristocratic hunters gathered round to regale each other with tales of their bravest kills and most impressive spear thrusts. Some perhaps more embellished than others after a few cups of wine, before retiring to their chambers, exhausted but invigorated from a long day of tracking, chasing, and killing defenseless animals. Just another relaxing pastime for the medieval nobleman and woman, and certainly more thrilling than needlepoint. But not all lords and ladies were satisfied with slaughtering the local wildlife for sport. Some set their sights a bit higher, literally. Let's turn our attention to the ancient and noble art of falconry, the perfect hobby for anyone who wanted a pet that could murder other animals on command. Because who wants to cuddle a cute little bunny when you could have a bird of prey perched on your wrist, ready to sink its talons into whatever small furry woodland creature looked especially tasty that day? Falconry was like the private jet equivalent of medieval hunting. While any old noble could round up some dogs and crash through the forest chasing after a deer, it took a special breed to master the art of falconry. Handlers, called falconers, had to capture and train their birds through a careful process that involved hoods, jesses, and a whole lot of patience. Like an especially strict prep school, young birds started off as an ayaz, then became a passenger, and finally graduated to the level of haggard, terms that sound more appropriate for a biker gang than a bunch of birds, but the Middle Ages had a flair for the dramatic. Once a falcon was trained, the real fun began. The noble falconer, bird perched imperiously on their leather-gloved fist, rode out in search of prey, scanning the skies and fields for a glimpse of something small and furry, and preferably not too fast. When a likely victim was spotted, the falcon was let loose, swooping through the air like a feathery guided missile locked onto the racing heartbeat of a terrified rabbit or pheasant, or whatever hapless creature had the misfortune to be the falcon's designated lunch that day. If all went well, for the falcon and falconer, not so much the prey, the bird sank its razor-sharp talons into the small animal, giving a triumphant cry to alert its human hunting partner that the deed was done. The noble falconer retrieved their bird and its kill, rewarding it with a few tasty morsels before placing it back on its perch for the trip home. Clearly, falconry required a close bond and clear communication between human and bird, and a shared taste for blood sport. Among the nobility, falconry was the ultimate status symbol. The bigger and rarer your bird, the more impressive you were. Like the supercar collectors of today, the elite clamoured for the sleekest, most powerful birds of prey to show off. For instance, the gerfalcon, a majestic white raptor that could reach speeds of up to 130 miles per hour in pursuit of prey, was the Lamborghini of the falconry world, highly coveted and worth a small fortune. European nobles had the hawking game on lock, but they weren't the only ones who appreciated a bird that could kill on command. In the Middle East, falconry was an ancient tradition, thought to date back thousands of years to the nomadic tribes of the Central Asian steppes, who first figured out that birds of prey were better hunters than humans with bows and arrows could ever hope to be. The Mongols, those hard-riding nomadic warriors that swept across Asia and Europe in the 13th century, were also avid falconers who brought their love of killer birds with them as they conquered half the known world. But while falconry may have been born on the battlefield, it quickly became the favoured pastime of the elite from Morocco to Mongolia. The Arab caliphs and Persian emperors kept elaborate mews filled with hundreds of birds and an army of falconers to tend to them. Falcons even found their way into Islamic art and literature as symbols of nobility and grace, which is a lot nicer than being remembered as murderous sky puppets, which is essentially what they were. But as with so many things in the Middle Ages, falconry was as much about flashy displays of wealth and status as it was about actually catching game. The most prestigious birds weren't necessarily the best hunters, but the ones with the most impressive plumage or the heftiest price tag. The ultimate trophy falcon was the white gerfalcon, which was so rare and expensive that it was said only a king could afford one. In fact, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a medieval falconry influencer, was so obsessed with his birds that he wrote a whole book on the subject and was known to bring his falcons to church with him perched on his arm, which must have made for some very distracting sermons. But while Frederick and his feathery friends were turning heads at Mass, his contemporary Kublai Khan, grandson of the infamous Genghis and ruler of the Mongol Empire at its height, was using falconry for more practical purposes, namely, training his birds to take out enemy soldiers on the battlefield. That's right, the Mongols weren't content with just conquering most of the known world on horseback. They had to get their birds in on the action too. Kublai Khan was said to have a fearsome flock of falcons, eagles and other birds of prey that he used as a sort of feathered air force, sending them to dive bomb his enemies and even carry messages between his far-flung armies. And you thought carrier pigeons were impressive. But perhaps the most famous falconry aficionado of the Middle Ages was a woman who met a tragic end doing what she loved. Mary of Burgundy, daughter of the fabulously wealthy and powerful Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, was a passionate devotee of hawking from a young age. Born in Brussels in 1457, Mary was the heiress to the vast Duchy of Burgundy, a territory spanning from the Low Countries to Switzerland that was renowned for its opulence, art, and chivalric culture. But while other noble ladies were content to sit in their solar embroidering and gossiping, Mary was out in the fields with her birds, hawking from dawn to dusk. She was said to have a particular fondness for merlins, small, fierce falcons that were prized for their agility and speed in pursuing prey. Mary was so devoted to her birds that she even had a custom saddle made with a special perch on the pommel so she could ride with her falcon at the ready. But Mary's love of falconry would prove to be her undoing. In 1482, at the age of just 25, Mary was out hawking with her ladies in waiting when her horse stumbled and threw her to the ground. She suffered a severe injury to her back and died a few days later, plunging her duchy into a succession crisis and political turmoil. It was a tragic end for a vibrant young woman who embodied the chivalric ideals of her time, a skilled horsewoman, a passionate patron of the arts, and a leader who fearlessly defended her lands against the grasping hands of France. Today, Mary is remembered as a symbol of the power and precarity of medieval womanhood, a duchess who ruled in her own right, but whose life was cut short by a cruel twist of fate. As for her beloved birds, they likely flew off to new masters, their jessers trailing behind them like a final farewell to the woman who had loved them so fiercely in life. But Mary's legacy as a falconer lives on, a testament to the enduring allure of a sport that blended skill, speed, and a touch of savage beauty into one thrilling, if deadly, pastime. So there you have it, a glimpse into the wild world of medieval falconry, where birds were status symbols, battlefield weapons, and loyal companions all rolled into one fierce feathered package. It's a far cry from the pet parakeets and cockatiels we keep today. But then again, everything in the Middle Ages was just a little bit extra, from the towering cathedrals to the 10-foot-long poulains. Even the pets were over the top. From falconry to fooding, hunting to hawking, chivalry to the chase, The aristocrats of medieval Europe certainly knew how to entertain themselves in between all the warring and wealth building. But don't worry, it wasn't all fun and games for the feudal elite. The poor peasants who did all the actual work had their humble delights too, like not dying of the plague and occasionally having enough to eat. Right, let's move on from the highborn hunters and their deadly pets to explore the more down-to-earth entertainments of the common folk. And no, I don't just mean watching the local lord ride by in his finery and fantasizing about eating his horse. Fair days provided a welcome respite from the daily toil and troubles of medieval life. All over Europe, from mighty London to quaint villages, people looked forward to special festivals and saints' days that promised feasting, revelry and wonder. One of the most raucous and eagerly anticipated of these was Carnival, the indulgent period preceding the austere fasting of Lent. Carnival celebrations date back to ancient pagan festivals, but in the Middle Ages, they took on a distinctly Christian flavour, while still retaining an air of mischief and mystery. For a few fleeting days, the normal order of society was turned on its head. Perhaps no rulers embraced the spirit of Carnival with quite as much enthusiasm as the Dukes of Burgundy in the 15th century. The Burgundian court was renowned across Europe for its opulence, artistry and pageantry, and the Dukes spared no expense when it came to Mardi Gras. In 1454, Duke Philip the Good staged an extravaganza in the Flemish city of Lille that was remembered for generations. Against a mesmerizing backdrop of torches, tapestries and flowers, nobles cloaked in luxurious costumes paraded through the streets accompanied by musicians, marching soldiers carrying pikes, and elaborate floats depicting religious and mythological scenes. Crowds of common folk jostled for a glimpse of the exotic animals like camels and elephants in Philip's menagerie. Fountains flowed with wine as onlookers scrambled to fill their cups. Troubadours and poets performed ballads regaling the Duke's chivalry and might. And as night fell, a lavish banquet commenced in the Duke's palace, featuring a dizzying array of delicacies like roast peacock, candied violets, and sugary sculptures. The climax came when Philip made his grand entrance dressed as a woodsman, the torchlight glinting off his cloth of gold. Before all the assembled nobles, he solemnly vowed to take up the cross and embark on a crusade to recapture Constantinople from the Turks, a pledge known as the Feast of the Pheasant. Though Philip never actually fulfilled this oath, his carnival vow exemplified the dreamlike splendour of Burgundy at its height. Further north in England, a rather different carnival tradition emerged, the election of boy bishops. In a playful inversion of church hierarchy, young boys were chosen to lead religious services and even deliver a sermon before the grown clergyman on Holy Innocents' Day. This peculiar custom, recorded as early as the 10th century, became widespread and was practiced in many of England's great cathedrals and monasteries. One can only imagine the bemused faces of the worshippers as a nervously grinning boy gave a squeaky-voiced homily dressed in outsized bishop's robes and mitre. More rambunctious was the similar tradition of appointing a Lord of Misrule, a mock king who presided over the Feast of Fools and other carnival revelries. Usually portrayed by a young layman, this impudent character was tasked with stirring up mischief and laughter, turning convention on its head. The Lord of Misrule served as a master of ceremonies, leading processions of costumed revellers, initiating burlesque pantomimes that parodied the stiffness of royal courts, and even delivering saucy edicts that gently skewered political elites. Some misrule mandates could get quite bawdy indeed. One recorded example from the Abbey of Unreason in Scotland cheekily proclaimed, in the name of high drunkenness, that monks should sit for prayers, drink only ale, and make better cheer than ever before. Of course, the actual authorities usually kept a wary eye on such antics, lest the foolery get out of hand. There were occasional crackdowns by disapproving bishops or town fathers. But by and large, a few days of silliness and sanctioned satire provided a much-needed steam valve in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. While Carnival brought a burst of festivity in late winter, other celebrations were sprinkled throughout the medieval calendar. The Midsummer Feast of St. John the Baptist featured bonfires, dancing, and love divinations in many areas. Young women floated wreaths with candles on rivers and streams, hoping to glean clues about their future husbands from the flickering flames. If a girl's wreath sank, it was an ominous sign that she would not marry that year. Fragrant herbs like rosemary and St. John's wort were gathered and strewn about homes to ward off evil spirits. In an intriguing melding of pagan and Christian traditions, the magical plants were then saved and burned in the Yule log at Christmas. Speaking of magical plants, the autumn feast of St. Michael featured a perhaps surprising star, the humble carrot. Though a common vegetable now, carrots were a relative novelty in the Middle Ages after being introduced via Moorish Spain. Their sweet flavour and vivid orange colour made them a great delicacy. At Michaelmas, women hoping to snag a husband were advised to sleep with a carrot under their pillow and recite, Saint Michel, my lover you know well, by dreams let me see, the youth that I shall marry. Apparently slumbering with a root vegetable was quite the aphrodisiac. If visions of Mr. Right failed to appear, at least the lady awoke to a handy snack. Beyond Saints' Days, every town and village had its own local festivals commemorating events like the anniversary of the parish church's consecration or the birth of a royal heir. Though smaller in scale than splashy tournaments or courtly banquets, these community gatherings fostered shared identity and relief from daily drudgery. Imagine the buzz of excitement in a sleepy English hamlet as people gathered for the festival of the church's patron saint. The scent of roasting meat wafted on the breeze as an ox was turned on a spit over crackling flames. Lads and lasses flirted and danced around a gaily decorated maypole to the tune of a fiddle and drum. Merry wives gossiped and cackled as they strung garlands of wildflowers. Intense youths tested their mettle in archery and wrestling contests. A sense of fellowship flowed along with the barrels of foamy ale the local reeve provided. For one day at least, the grueling cycle of planting and ploughing could be forgotten. Even in the humblest villages, a cherished feature of festivals was the mystery plays. These simple dramas reenacted stories from the Bible and lives of saints and martyrs. In the days before widespread literacy, mystery plays made religious narratives accessible to common people and provided rare opportunities for creative expression. Members of various trade guilds, the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers, took responsibility for staging different episodes that matched their craft. So the shipbuilders might dramatize Noah's Ark, the vintners, the wedding at Cana, and so on. The plays unfolded on wagons converted into makeshift stages that rolled through town, stopping at predetermined stations to perform each scene. Though the subject matter was sacred, that didn't prevent some unintentionally humorous moments. Since special effects were rather rudimentary, angels made do with chicken feathers glued to a white robe. Fiery hellmouths, constructed of red-painted paper, flapped open to receive the damned. An actor playing Herod might rant and rage, only to get his fake beard stuck on his crown. In the famous Second Shepherds play, a thief trying to hide a stolen lamb from the suspicious shepherds tries to pass it off as a newborn baby. The mistaken identity hijinks must have had audiences in stitches. One can imagine a hard-working peasant guffawing in delight as Noah bickered with his mouthy wife, perhaps recognizing his own marital spats. Laughter, even at somewhat sacrilegious humor, provided a healing balm for lives that could often be nasty, brutish, and short. For a few mirth-filled hours, the stern doctrines of the church took a back seat to pure, uproarious entertainment. Kings and commoners alike shared in the collective catharsis of carnival frolics, midsummer merriment, and homespun harvest gaiety. So when your days feel dreary and your spirits sag, just remember those tenacious medieval merrymakers. With a candlelit wreath, a sugary sculpture, or a lamb standing in for the baby Jesus, they found reasons to revel in the toughest of times. Weary serf and haughty duke alike cherished their hard-won holidays. Perhaps some similar silliness is in order. Grab a carrot for your pillow and invoke the power of Saint, Michael's love magic. Appoint a pal as Lord of Misrule and issue some mock edicts. A little festive foolery might be just the pick-me-up a trying day demands. And with that whimsical advice, I bid you good night, fair listener. May your dreams be filled with noble knights and naughty jesters, merry maypoles and mysterious miracle plays. For in sleep, as in laughter, the cares of the world melt away. Until next time, rest ye merry, one and all. Thank you for that. You're right. Gluckhaus gambling houses were quite a sensation when they debuted in medieval Venice. Though the exact details are lost to history, most scholars agree these were some of the earliest dedicated gambling parlours in Europe. Venetians, with their love of games and wagers, enthusiastically embraced these new establishments. Picture the scene. You stroll through the winding cobblestone streets of Venice, narrow buildings rising up on either side, laundry strung between windows. The air is thick with the brine of the canals and the sizzle of frying seafood. Rounding a corner, you come upon an elaborately painted door, the entrance to the Gluckhaus. Laughter and clinking of goblets issues from within. Passing through the doorway, you enter a hazy den of merriment and vice. Gamblers crowd around tables, the strain of wins and losses playing across their faces in the flickering candlelight. A trio of minstrels picks out a jaunty tune in the corner. Servers wind through the throng carrying trays of wine and plates of antipasti. Making your way to one of the tables, you survey the game in progress. Funny-looking dice carved from animal bones rattle in a shooter's hand. Wooden discs serving as betting markers are piled haphazardly. The gamblers, noblemen, and merchants alike cajole each other and curse the dice in colourful Venetian slang. As a new round begins, a hush falls over the gamblers. The shooter gives the dice a blow for luck and casts them clattering across the table. Cheers erupt as the dice come to rest, revealing a winning roll. Coins are scooped towards the lucky few as the losers groan. You catch the eye of a grizzled, one-eyed gambler, his face a map of hard living. He shoots you a gap-toothed grin. "Sit down, friend, and test your luck," he rasps, gesturing to an empty chair. "Fickle mistress Fortuna calls." Tossing caution to the wind, you slide into the seat and take up the dice. A new player has entered the game at the Gluckhaus. Ah, but we can't spend all night carousing in this den of chance, as enticing as that might seem. The scene fades into the shadows as we take our leave of the jolly Gluckhaus. So many other medieval divertissements still beckon us onward. But it's remarkable to think that the gambling spirit that animated those Venetian dice players is still very much alive today, even if the games have changed. And so we turn from the rattle of dice to the thunder of hoofbeats. The medieval tournament ground calls. For noble knights and enthusiastic common folk alike, nothing could match the pageantry and excitement of a grand tournament. It was a chance for skilled warriors to test their mettle, and for spectators to marvel at displays of martial prowess. One of the most celebrated knights of the tournament circuit was William Marshall, a man who rose from humble origins to become renowned as the greatest knight in Christendom. Marshall was the younger son of a minor English nobleman, but his skill with the lance and sword would make him a legend. In his youth, Marshall was sent to Normandy to train in the arts of knighthood. He proved a quick study with a natural gift for the bruising physicality of mounted combat. Soon, he was travelling the tournament circuit as a roving knight-errant, making a name for himself with his victories. Imagine the scene as Marshall arrives at a tournament ground. a broad field bustling with activity under a bright blue sky. Gaily coloured tents and pavilions surround the list field where the jousting will take place. Pennants snap in the breeze, each one emblazoned with the coat of arms of a participating knight. The thunder of hoofbeats announces a column of armoured knights riding onto the field, martial among them. His armour is unadorned, workmanlike. He has no need for frippery. The knights take their places at either end of the list, couching their lances and preparing to charge. A hush falls over the crowd as a herald steps forth and begins announcing the combatants with a trumpet fanfare. The noble ladies wave their favours to their chosen champions. Then, at a signal from the master of ceremonies, the knights spur their horses into a gallop. Lances lower into place as the knights hurtle towards each other, sun glinting off their armour. With a titanic crash, they collide in the centre of the list. Lances shatter in explosions of splinters. A knight tumbles from his saddle, his armour clanging as he hits the ground. But Marshall keeps his seat, expertly guiding his steed to the end of the list. Squires scurry to supply him with a fresh lance. He wheels about and readies himself for the next pass. This display of skill and bravery is what has won Marshall such renown on the tournament fields of Europe. As the day wears on, Marshall bests challenger after challenger. The crowd applauds his gallantry and prowess. Some onlookers even dash out to scoop up pieces of his shattered lances as souvenirs. By the end of the tournament, Marshall is declared the champion. He dips his lance to the noble lord hosting the event as the crowd cheers. With his string of tournament victories and reputation for honesty and loyalty, William Marshall caught the eye of some powerful patrons. He would go on to serve as a household knight for Eleanor of Aquitaine and tournament captain for her son, Henry the young king. Even as he entered the service of the Plantagenet royal family, Marshall still found time to compete in tournaments. In 1177, he journeyed to Paris to participate in a grand tournament, a melee hosted by the French crown. After handily defeating all comers, Marshall was set to face off against the king's kinsman. But the opponent's lackluster skill was no match for Marshall. The crowds began to jeer and heckle the hapless French knight. Seeking to salvage his kinsman's dignity, the king begged Marshall to throw the match. True to his reputation for loyalty, Marshall dutifully took a dive, allowing himself to be flung from his horse. The French knight was allowed to save face, but no one was fooled. Marshall's chivalry and honour only burnished his legend. He would go on to serve as tutor in chivalry to Henry the young king, and earn fame defending Henry's claim to the throne in the Great Rebellion of 1173. Marshall's tournament exploits were the making of his reputation, but they were far from the end of his story. His integrity and battle prowess would see him become a respected statesman, regent, and advisor to no less than 5 English kings. But those are tales for another time. For now, the shadows lengthen over the tournament ground as the day's final match comes to an end. The crowds begin to disperse back to their pavilions, and the knights retire to their tents to be helped out of their armour by their squires. Blacksmiths begin the task of hammering dents out of helms and breastplates by firelight. The tournament has been a rousing spectacle, a welcome jolt of excitement for commoners and nobles alike. In a time when warfare was grim and all too common, the tournament allowed knights to test their skills in a more controlled setting. It was a chance for glory, fanfare, and gallantry. The tournament grounds grow quiet as night settles in, and the revellers seek their beds. But the glow of the day's excitement lingers, a happy memory to revisit in times of drudgery or hardship. In a medieval world that could often be brutal and harsh, the tournament was a cherished escape into pageantry and sport. But the call of the tournament is only one of many tantalising amusements drawing us onward. The flicker of the Renaissance is still only a distant glow on the horizon. There are centuries of medieval entertainments yet to explore, each a window into the dreams and pastimes of a long ago world. Our journey through the Middle Ages continues. But for now, the candles gutter low, and the velvet night wraps us in its embrace. Surely it is time for these weary old bones to seek the comfort of bed and pillow. There will be more wild medieval tales to spin upon the morrow. So I bid you good night, gentle listener. May your slumber be easy and your dreams sweet, untainted by the clang and clamour of the tournament field. Rest now, and on the morrow, our quest for medieval merriment shall resume with vigour renewed. Until then, I remain your humble guide, the chronicler of centuries past. Adieu. In the harsh and often short lives of medieval peasants, entertainment provided a rare respite from backbreaking toil and the ever-present spectre of disease, famine, and violence. While the nobility had the leisure and wealth to indulge in more refined and extravagant amusements, even the lowliest serfs found ways to infuse some merriment into their meagre existence. One of the simplest yet most beloved peasant pastimes was dancing. On feast days and holidays, villagers would gather to perform lively jigs, reels, and circle dances accompanied by whatever makeshift instruments they could muster: pipes, drums, fiddles played by itinerant minstrels if they were lucky. There was little in the way of formal steps or choreography. These dances were free-form expressions of pure joy and communal celebration. For a few precious moments, the worries of the workaday world could be forgotten in a whirl of flailing limbs and stomping feet. Another perennially popular diversion was the humble game of bowls. All that was needed was a relatively flat patch of ground and some rounded stones or wooden balls. Players would take turns tossing their balls, aiming to land them as close as possible to a smaller target ball, called the jack or kitty. It was a game that could be enjoyed by young and old alike, men and women, making it a staple of village greens and tavern yards across Europe. Speaking of taverns, these establishments were the closest thing most medieval peasants had to an entertainment venue. After a long day in the fields, men would gather to quaff ale, swap stories, sing bawdy songs, and perhaps engage in some friendly wagering on dice or card games. Gambling with dice had been popular since ancient Roman times, and the medieval versions wasn't much different. Simply toss the dice and hope that your number comes up. Not exactly Vegas, but it added an extra thrill to the night's revelry. Of course, peasant fun couldn't hold a candle to the opulent amusements enjoyed by the nobility. Imagine, if you will, the splendour of a grand tournament held by a wealthy lord. Knights in gleaming armour astride snorting steeds, vividly colourful banners snapping in the breeze, the thunder of hooves and the crash of lances as the champions vied for glory and riches before a cheering crowd. It was like a blockbuster sporting event and a rock concert rolled into one. But even for the nobility, life wasn't all jousts and banquets. In a world where warfare was the order of the day, tournaments served as a way for knights to hone their combat skills. As the saying goes, next to war, there is nothing more like war than a tournament. Training for these mock battles began in childhood, with young pages and squires learning the arts of swordplay, lancing, and horsemanship under the tutelage of veteran knights. One of the most famous of these knightly tutors was William Marshall, who rose from humble origins to become the greatest tournament champion of his age, and a trusted advisor to no less than 5 English kings. Born in 1147 to a minor noble family, William was given to the king as a hostage when he was just 5 years old, a surety for his father's good behaviour. When his father failed to keep his word, the king threatened to have young William catapulted over the castle walls to his death. But fortunately for William and for England, the king's cruel bluff was never called. The boy was spared and sent to Normandy to receive a proper knightly education. There he excelled in the martial arts, quickly making a name for himself on the tournament circuit. His skill with a lance was unmatched. He once even managed to kill 3 adversaries with a single blow, impaling one through the chest and driving the splintered lance through his body into the 2 men behind him. Ouch. But William was more than just a brute in armour. He was also renowned for his honour, chivalry, and loyalty. When King Henry II's sons rebelled against their father, William remained steadfastly by the old king's side. And when Henry died a broken man, it was William who personally carried his body to be buried at Fontevraud Abbey. Such fealty did not go unrewarded. William went on to serve Henry's successors with equal distinction, acting as a chief advisor, diplomat, and military commander. By the time of his own death in 1219, he had amassed a vast fortune through tournament winnings and royal land grants. He was even made Regent of England on behalf of the child King Henry III. Not bad for a boy who had once been dangled over the edge of a castle by his ankles. Of course, not every tournament had such lofty political stakes. Many were held simply for the sheer spectacle and sport of it all. The grandest of these extravaganzas could last for days or even weeks, drawing knights and spectators from across Europe. One such event was the tournament at Châlons in 1274, hosted by the Count of Châlons in the French region of Champagne. It was a lavish affair, with over 300 knights in attendance. Among them were the cream of European chivalry, including the dashing Edward, Prince of Wales, later King Edward I of England. But what began as a friendly competition soon took a turn for the scandalous. During a joust, Edward's lance struck the Count of Châlons with such force that it knocked him clear off his horse. Enraged, the Count accused the Prince of unchivalrous conduct and demanded an apology. But Edward was having none of it. In a fit of youthful bravado, he proclaimed, "No Frenchman shall have my submission," and stormed out of the tournament with his entourage in tow. The incensed Count vowed revenge, but cooler heads eventually prevailed. A truce was brokered, and Edward went on to compete in the tournament, winning accolades for his prowess. But the incident left a lingering bad taste and soured relations between the English and French courts. Such diplomatic tensions were not uncommon in the world of medieval tournaments. These events weren't just about athletic glory. They were also a way for nobles to flaunt their wealth, power, and prestige. A well-run tournament could cement a lord's reputation and influence, attracting allies and intimidating rivals. Conversely, a poorly managed or sparsely attended affair could be a humiliating blow to a noble's standing. No one understood this better than René of Anjou, the 15th century French duke and king who was nicknamed the Good for his reputation as a just and enlightened ruler. René was a true Renaissance man, a skilled knight, a patron of the arts, and a master at the game of courtly politics. He knew that a dazzling tournament could be a powerful tool for winning hearts and minds. In 1446, René staged a grand tournament at his capital of Nancy that was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Dubbed the Pas de la Bergère, or Shepherdess's Dance, it was a whimsical blend of chivalric pageantry and theatrics inspired by the pastoral romance of the Middle Ages. Knights dressed as shepherds and shepherdesses, competing not just in jousts, but in poetry contests, song and dance numbers, and even sheep herding trials using real livestock. It was all highly allegorical, of course. The shepherdess represented the virtues of courtly love, which the knights would strive to defend and embody. But it was also a showcase for the wealth and sophistication of René's court. The lavish costumes, elaborate sets, and exotic animals on display sent a clear message. Anjou was a cultural force to be reckoned with. The highlight of the tournament was the Pas d'Armes, or Passage of Arms, in which daring knights would attempt to cross a mock fortress bridge defended by René and his hand-picked champions. It was a feat of arms straight out of Arthurian legend, meant to evoke the daunting perils and rewards of the chivalric quest. For days, the cream of European knighthood tried and failed to best René's team, much to the delight of the crowd. The Duke himself, dressed in resplendent gold armour, held the bridge like a latter-day Lancelot. In the end, it was his own brother-in-law, the dashing Ferry de Lorraine, who finally managed to unhorse René and seize the prize. But the real winner was René himself. The Pas de la Bergère was a public relations coup, establishing Anjou as a centre of culture and chivalry. It also cemented René's personal reputation as a model of kingly virtue, a deft mixer of war and courtliness. His subjects hailed him as a new King Arthur, the once and future king of their dreams. Alas, not every ruler could live up to such lofty ideals. In 1274, a very different sort of monarch mounted the throne of England. Edward I, the same hot-headed prince who had stormed out of the tournament at Chalons all those years ago. Edward was a fierce and canny warrior king, more interested in conquering Wales and Scotland than in playing shepherd. He embodied the harsher realities of medieval kingship, where might made right and chivalry was often just a thin veneer over the naked exercise of power. But even Edward recognized the value of a well-staged spectacle. In 1306, he held a massive tournament at Winchester to celebrate the knighting of his son, the future Edward II. Over 500 knights from across Europe attended, making it one of the largest chivalric gatherings of the Middle Ages. The festivities kicked off with a grand procession through the streets of Winchester, led by the guest of honour himself. Young Edward, just 22 years old, cut a dashing figure in his gilded armour, his surcoat emblazoned with the 3 lions of England. Behind him rode a glittering cavalcade of knights and nobles, their colourful banners fluttering in the breeze. At the tournament grounds, a makeshift village of tents and pavilions had sprung up to accommodate the crowds. Vendors hawked everything from roasted meats to holy relics, while minstrels and acrobats entertained the masses. It was like a cross between a state fair and a Super Bowl tailgate party. But the real action was on the tournament field. For 3 days, the knights clashed in a dizzying array of martial contests, jousts, melees, mounted combat with swords and maces. The thunder of hooves and the clang of steel echoed across the grounds, whipping the spectators into a frenzy. Fortunes and reputations were made and lost on the tilt yard. One young knight in particular stood out from the pack, the dashing Piers Gaveston, a childhood friend and favourite of Prince Edward. Piers was a skilled jouster and a born showman, with a flair for the dramatic both on and off the field. He and Edward made a striking pair, 2 golden boys revelling in their youth and prowess. But their bond would prove to be a double-edged sword. When Edward II came to the throne a few years later, he showered Piers with lands, titles and honours, provoking the ire of the other nobles. The arrogant young Gascon was seen as an upstart, a corrupter of the king who needed to be taken down a peg. In 1312, the tensions finally boiled over. A baronial faction, led by Edward's cousin, Thomas of Lancaster, seized Piers and had him beheaded on the grounds of Blacklow Hill. It was a shocking act of lèse-majesté, a direct challenge to Edward's royal authority, but it was also a sign of the changing times. The age of chivalry was giving way to the cold calculations of realpolitik. Edward never forgot the loss of his beloved companion. For the rest of his reign, he fought an ultimately losing battle to assert his will over his fractious nobility. In the end, he was deposed by his own wife and son, meeting a grim fate in the dungeons of Berkeley Castle. It was an ignominious end for a king who had once been the brightest star of the tournament circuit. But while the world of chivalry was fading, the grand tournaments of old still lived on in the popular imagination. Nowhere was this more evident than in the elaborate round tables staged by Edward III in the mid-14th century. These events were a conscious throwback to the legendary court of King Arthur, complete with jousting, feasting, and Arthurian-themed pageantry. The most famous of these was held at Windsor Castle in 1344 to celebrate the founding of Edward's new chivalric order, the Order of the Garter. According to legend, The order was inspired by an incident at a ball when Edward's mistress, the Countess of Salisbury, dropped her garter on the dance floor. Gallantly picking it up, Edward tied it around his own leg, declaring, "Honi soit qui mal y pense." Roughly, shame on anyone who thinks ill of this. The phrase became the motto of the order, which still exists to this day. But the real purpose of the Order of the Garter was to bind England's leading nobles to the crown, creating a core of loyal knights who could help Edward project his power at home and abroad. It was a shrewd move, one that played on the lingering prestige and mystique of the Arthurian legends. By styling himself as a new King Arthur, Edward was tapping into a deep well of chivalric nostalgia. The Round Table tournament at Windsor was a suitably grandiose affair. A massive wooden grandstand was erected in the shape of a circular castle, with towers and battlements bristling with heraldic banners. In the centre was a model of the fabled Round Table itself, around which sat Edward and his new Garter Knights, resplendent in their blue velvet robes and golden chains. For 5 days, the knights jousted and feasted, reenacting the legendary exploits of Arthur and his court. They even staged a mock siege of the Castle of Maidens, with Edward himself leading the charge to rescue the damsels in distress, played by the Queen and her ladies-in-waiting. It was all highly theatrical, a piece of living mythopoeia, but amid the pageantry and spectacle, there was a darker undercurrent. Just a few months earlier, Edward had executed 14 of his own barons for treason, including several who had been involved in the death of Piers Gaveston. The Round Table tournament was in part an effort to paper over these divisions, to create a facade of chivalric unity. In the end, though, the real world could not be kept at bay forever. Even as Edward and his knights played at being Arthur and Lancelot, the Black Death was creeping across Europe, a grim reaper that would claim millions of lives and shatter the old feudal order. The age of chivalry was drawing to a close, and a new, harsher era was dawning. But for a brief, shining moment, the grand tournaments of old had brought a touch of Camelot to the muddy fields of medieval England. They were a glorious anachronism, a last hurrah for a dying way of life. And while the world they represented may have been deeply flawed, there was still something undeniably alluring about their pageantry and romance. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander back to those distant days of yore. Picture the colourful tents and pavilions, the glittering armour and heraldic banners. Hear the thunder of hooves and the roar of the crowd, the twang of lutes and the jingle of bells. Imagine yourself as a knight or lady caught up in the swirl of chivalric intrigue and courtly love. And remember that, even in the darkest of times, people have always found ways to come together and celebrate the joys of life. Whether it was through grand tournaments or simple village dances, our ancestors knew the value of a good party. So let us take a page from their book and find our own ways to make merry and chase away the shadows. Good night, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with the stuff of legends. Now, if we step back from the tilt yard and into the great halls of medieval castles, we find ourselves in the sumptuous world of courtly feasts and banquets. These were not just meals, but full-blown sensory extravaganzas, designed to showcase the wealth, power, and sophistication of the host. The grandest of these affairs could last for days or even weeks, with a dizzying array of dishes, entertainments, and distractions. The feast given by King Charles V of France in 1378 to celebrate the Holy Roman Emperor's visit reportedly featured over 50 courses, including such delicacies as roasted peacocks redressed in their own plumage, and a pie filled with live birds that burst forth in song when the crust was cut. But even a more modest noble feast was a sight to behold. Picture a great hall decked out in rich tapestries and hangings, with trestle tables groaning under the weight of silver platters and golden goblets. At the head table sits the lord and lady of the castle, surrounded by their most honoured guests and retainers. Down the centre of the hall stretches a long table, flanked by benches for the lesser nobles and gentry. They are seated in strict order of precedence, with the most highborn nearest the Lord's table. The salt cellar, a large, ornate vessel for holding salt, marks the dividing line between the upper and lower ranks. To be seated below the salt was a sign of inferior status. As the guests take their seats, a procession of servants enters bearing the first course, perhaps a subtlety or entremet, an elaborate edible sculpture meant to amuse and impress. It might take the... Continuing the script. The merry entertainments and feasts of the nobles may have offered a welcome diversion from medieval life's hardships, but for the majority of people, the simple joys of seasonal festivals and fairs were often the highlight of the year. These special occasions punctuated the calendar, giving commoners a much-needed break from the daily toil and drudgery that filled most of their days. Perhaps the most exuberant and raucous of these celebrations was Carnival, the indulgent period of feasting and revelry that preceded the austere fasting of Lent. With roots stretching back to ancient pagan traditions, Carnival was a time when the normal rules and hierarchies of society were temporarily suspended. For a few fleeting days, the world turned upside down as people donned masks and costumes, parading through the streets in a joyous explosion of music, dancing, and mischief. Carnival reached its height in the grand cities of medieval Europe, where the festivities often lasted for weeks and were marked by lavish public spectacles and banquets. In the 15th century, the opulent Dukes of Burgundy were particularly renowned for their decadent Mardi Gras celebrations. These sumptuous affairs unfolded in their capital of Dijon, as extravagantly costumed nobles and citizens alike thronged the streets, indulging in rich food, fine wine, and unbridled merrymaking. One can only imagine the sights, sounds, and smells that would have greeted a visitor to Dijon during the peak of Carnival. Minstrels and troubadours filled the air with lively tunes, while acrobats and jugglers performed daring feats to the delight of the crowds. Amidst it all, the tantalizing scent of roasting meats and sweet pastries wafted from the numerous stalls and vendors, tempting revelers with their savory wares. As night fell, the Duke's palace would blaze with the light of 1,000 candles as the nobility gathered for a magnificent masked ball. Lords and ladies, their identities concealed behind colourful disguises, twirled and spun to the strains of a merry tune. For one enchanted evening, the cares and burdens of rank and responsibility could be forgotten as all gave themselves over to the joys of music, dance, and good company. Yet even as the nobility celebrated in grand style, the common folk also found their own ways to revel in the carnival spirit. One of the most popular and enduring traditions was the election of a mock king, or Lord of Misrule, to preside over the festivities. This mischievous figure, usually a peasant or lowly cleric, was appointed to lead the people in a playful parody of the official order. In many towns, the Lord of Misrule held court in the local tavern, issuing ridiculous proclamations and demanding that his subjects perform outrageous feats and stunts for his amusement. It was a time when the humble could poke fun at the mighty, with bawdy songs and satirical skits that lampooned the follies and vices of those in power. Another beloved carnival custom was the Feast of Fools, an irreverent celebration in which young choir boys and lowly priests were temporarily elevated to positions of authority within the church. In a complete inversion of the normal hierarchy, a boy bishop was elected to lead the revels, conducting absurd mock masses and blessing the congregation with good-natured japes and jokes. While church leaders frequently tried to suppress these subversive rituals, fearing they would undermine the sanctity and solemnity of religious life, the common people embraced them wholeheartedly. For a few precious days, the heavy yoke of piety and obedience could be cast aside, as the lowly delighted in turning the tables on their betters. Of course, not all medieval festivities were quite so unruly or irreverent. Trade fairs in particular served a more practical purpose, bringing together merchants and craftsmen from far and wide to buy, sell, and exchange their wares. These bustling gatherings were often the economic and social lifeblood of medieval towns, drawing visitors from across the land. One of the largest and most renowned of these fairs was the Stourbridge Fair, held each September on the banks of the River Cam in the English town of Cambridge. Established in the 12th century and granted a formal charter by King John in 1211, Stourbridge Fair grew to become a commercial hub of international significance, attracting traders from as far afield as the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. For 3 weeks each year, the normally sleepy meadows outside Cambridge were transformed into a vast tented city, with countless stalls and booths selling everything from fine textiles and precious spices to livestock and agricultural tools. Merchants from Germany, Italy, and Flanders jostled alongside local farmers and craftsmen, haggling over prices and striking deals in a bewildering array of languages and dialects. Yet Stourbridge Fair was much more than just a place of business. It was also a vital social gathering, a chance for people to come together, share news and gossip, and enjoy a welcome break from the isolation and monotony of medieval life. Amidst the serious trade negotiations, there was also plenty of time for laughter, storytelling, and camaraderie. Wandering minstrels and acrobats mingled with the crowds, entertaining the fairgoers with their songs, jests, and feats of daring. Puppet shows and mystery plays, performed on makeshift stages, brought the stories of the Bible and the lives of the saints to vivid life, captivating audiences with their colourful pageantry and dramatic flair. As the sun began to set over the fair's final days, the weary merchants would pack up their unsold goods and begin the long journey home, their purses hopefully a bit heavier, and their hearts a bit lighter. For the locals too, the fair's end was a bittersweet moment, as the excitement and novelty of the past weeks gave way to the familiar rhythms of daily life. But the memories of the fair would linger long after the last tent was struck and the last coin changed hands. In the dark winter months to come, as people huddled around their hearths, they would reminisce about the wonders they had seen, the exotic tales they had heard, and the fleeting friendships they had made. And they would count the days until the fair returned once more, bringing with it the promise of novelty, companionship, and the chance to leave their cares behind, if only for a little while. In many ways, these fairs and festivals were more than just a diversion or a break from the hardships of medieval life. They were a vital reminder of the resilience and joy of the human spirit, a testament to people's ability to find moments of happiness and connection, even in the face of great adversity. So perhaps when we look back on the revelries and pastimes of the Middle Ages, we should not view them merely as curious historical oddities or quaint glimpses into a distant past. Rather, we should see in them a reflection of our own deep-seated need for community, for shared experiences, and for the fleeting magic of a world transformed, if only for a day. And as we drift off to sleep, our minds still filled with visions of colourful carnivals and bustling fairgrounds, we might just find ourselves dreaming of a time when life's simple pleasures were enough to make the heart sing. For in the end, the wild things that medieval people did for fun may not have been so very different from the things that bring us joy and laughter today. So let us all take a moment to raise our imaginary glass to the lords of misrule and the boy bishops, to the minstrels and the merchants, and to all those long ago revellers who knew that even in the darkest of times, there is always room for a bit of merriment and mirth. May their joyful spirits live on in our own hearts, and may we always remember to make time for the simple pleasures that make life worth living. And with that, my dear listeners, we come to the end of our journey through the wild and wonderful world of medieval pastimes. I hope you've enjoyed this whimsical tour through history as much as I've enjoyed sharing it with you. And I hope that as you drift off to sleep, your dreams will be filled not with the cares and worries of the present day, but with the laughter and joy of a time long past. So until next time, I bid you all a fond good night, and sweet dreams of carnival kings and fair day wonders. May the coming day bring you all the happiness and delight of a medieval festival, and may you find your own small moments of revelry and mirth wherever life may lead you. Script ends. Let's now turn our attention to one of the most peculiar yet popular pastimes of the medieval era: hunting and hawking. For the nobility, the pursuit of wild game was not merely a means of putting food on the table, but an elaborate ritual imbued with deep symbolic meaning. A successful hunt was seen as a demonstration of masculine prowess, a way for lords to bond with their peers, and even a metaphor for the triumph of order over the chaos of the natural world. But perhaps no one embodied the spirit of the medieval huntress quite like Mary of Burgundy. Born into the immensely wealthy House of Valois in 1457, Mary was the only child of Charles the Bold, the pugnacious Duke of Burgundy. With her father often away waging war, Mary grew up under the strong influence of her mother, Isabella of Bourbon, who instilled in her a lifelong passion for hunting and falconry. Contemporary accounts describe Mary as a lively, free-spirited tomboy, equally at home in the saddle or the Great Hall. She scandalized the Burgundian court by insisting on riding astride like a man rather than demurely side-saddle. Her favorite horse was named Moreau, and the two were inseparable companions. Mary's education was remarkably well-rounded for a woman of her time. In addition to needlework, dancing, and music, she learned horsemanship, archery, and how to train a falcon. By all accounts, Mary was a crack shot with a bow and a skilled huntress. One chronicle boasts that she could shoot a hare at full gallop. Her enthusiasm for the hunt was so great that she often neglected other duties. A court scribe laments how council meetings were perpetually delayed because Mary was off somewhere with her beloved birds and dogs. Mary's prized falcons were lavished with the finest accoutrements befitting their royal status. Their jesses, the leather straps used to tether them, were made of silk brocade or Moroccan leather studded with gemstones. The birds' hoods, used to keep them calm, were intricately embroidered with gold and silver thread and adorned with tassels and bells. Some hoods were even topped with miniature crowns. Mary employed a small army of falconers, hunters, and kennelmen to assist in her sport. Chief among them was her master of game, who oversaw the care and training of her precious birds and planned the logistics of each hunt. He ensured the mews, the building where the hawks were housed, was immaculate, and that each bird was fed its proper diet of fresh meat. Like most nobles, Mary practiced the great hunt on horseback, chasing deer and boar with a pack of swift hounds through the dense forests. The Duke of Burgundy's hunting lodge at La Berguière was her favourite retreat, nestled in a lush wood, teeming with game. There, Mary and her ladies would gather, dressed in rich green hunting cloaks, their hair bound up in golden nets beneath jaunty plumed caps. As the hunting party gathered, a chorus of barking would fill the misty morning air. The dog handlers would struggle to control the eager hounds, who strained at their leashes, their noses twitching for the scent of their quarry. The hunters carried an assortment of weapons, spears for boar, bows for deer, and a wood knife for dispatching the prey. With a blast of the hunting horn, they were off, thundering through the forest, with Mary leading the charge, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Witnessing her in the heat of the chase, you could almost forget she was a royal princess destined to wed and rule. In those fleeting moments, she was just Mary, the fierce huntress of Burgundy, as wild and untamed as the stag. But for all her skill and courage, no hunter can outrun fate. Mary's own story would be cut tragically short in 1482 when she was just 25 years old. In a terrible twist of irony, the Duchess, who so loved to hunt, would herself fall victim to a hunting accident. While pursuing herons with her falcons near Bruges, Mary's spirited horse Moreau tripped and fell, throwing her violently to the ground. Mary suffered devastating internal injuries and lingered in agony for several days before finally succumbing. Her inconsolable husband Maximilian, whom she had married for love, a rarity among royals, was at her bedside until the end. With her dying breath, Mary asked that her heart be entombed with her beloved Moreau. Mary of Burgundy's untimely death sent shockwaves across Europe and altered the political landscape as her rich territories passed to the Habsburgs. But among the people of Burgundy, she was remembered as a free spirit who lived and died pursuing her passions. Tales of Mary and her faithful Moreau riding to the hunt would be told for generations, a stirring tribute to a remarkable woman. While most medieval women did not enjoy Mary's freedoms, many did take part in the hunt in their own ways. Noble ladies often rode out with the hunters, not to chase game themselves, but to watch their men demonstrate their skill. They acted as cheerleaders from the sidelines, their cries of encouragement or derision echoing through the glades. Some highborn women kept their own hawks and even trained them, although on a much smaller scale than Mary's grand establishments. These pampered birds served more as living accessories than fierce hunters. A noblewoman might carry her little Merlin on a velvet cushion, or perch it decoratively on her wrist as she processed through the garden, its jesses and hood colour-coordinated with her gown. Even the clergy got in on the hawking craze, to the consternation of many. Bishops and abbots were some of the most ardent hunters, often neglecting their spiritual duties to spend hours in the field. Some even brought their birds to church, perching them behind the altar during Mass. One can only imagine the chaos that must have ensued when an agitated hawk decided to take flight in the middle of the service. For the lower classes, hunting was a more utilitarian affair, a way to supplement a meagre diet with fresh game. Peasants might set snares for rabbits or hunt small birds with slingshots and nets. But they had to tread carefully. Severe penalties awaited any commoner caught poaching the king's deer. The unlucky few who ran afoul of the forest laws could expect to have their hands or ears cut off. So the next time you're enjoying a quiet walk in the woods, spare a thought for the colourful world of medieval hunting. Imagine the thunder of galloping hooves, the baying of the hounds, and the triumphant blast of the hunting horn echoing through the trees. And if you happen to spot a falcon wheeling overhead, perhaps it's the spirit of Mary of Burgundy, forever pursuing her quarry through an eternal forest. Moving on from the vivid world of medieval hunting, let's explore a very different kind of spectacle that captivated the masses: the antics of travelling entertainers. To the delight of young and old alike, minstrels, acrobats, jugglers, and animal trainers roamed the roads of Europe, bringing a splash of colour and excitement wherever they went. But of all these wandering performers, perhaps none left as indelible a mark on history as a young 12th century Londoner named Thomas Becket. The son of a prosperous merchant, Thomas was a bright, charming lad with a quick wit and a flair for showmanship. As a youth, he earned his keep as a talented harpist and singer. Picture, if you will, a gangly, dark-eyed boy in a patched green tunic, his harp slung over his back as he wanders the muddy lanes of medieval London. With an impish grin, he sets up on a street corner and begins to play, his long, agile fingers dancing nimbly over the strings. His clear tenor voice rings out above the clamour of passing carts and barking dogs, weaving tales of heroic knights, fair maidens, and faraway lands. Soon, a small crowd gathers around the young bard, entranced by his lyrics and lively melodies. Merchants toss him pennies, housewives offer him hunks of bread, and children caper merrily to his tunes. For a few enchanted moments, the drudgery of their lives is forgotten, replaced by the magic of Thomas's music. Word of the boy's talent eventually reached the ears of Theobald, the powerful Archbishop of Canterbury. Impressed by Thomas's quick mind and courtly graces, Theobald took the young man under his wing, sending him off to study law and diplomacy at the universities of Paris and Bologna. Here fate took an unexpected turn. Thomas's wit, intelligence and charm won him the favour of the new king, Henry II. At just 36, Thomas found himself elevated to the lofty position of Lord Chancellor, becoming the king's chief advisor and right-hand man. The two were inseparable, bonding over a shared love of hunting, drinking, and womanizing. It was said only half-jokingly that they had but one heart and one mind. But the merry bromance was not to last. When the old archbishop died in 1162, Henry appointed Thomas as his successor, assuming the worldly, pliable chancellor would do his bidding. Instead, Thomas underwent a dramatic transformation, casting off his fine silks for a hair shirt and devoting himself wholly to the church. As the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas fiercely defended the rights and privileges of the clergy against the king's attempts to bring them under secular law. The once fast friends became the bitterest of enemies, locked in a titanic struggle for power that would convulse the realm. The feud came to a tragic head in 1170 when an enraged Henry, fuming over Thomas's latest act of defiance, rashly exclaimed, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 zealous knights, taking the king's words as a command, rode to Canterbury and brutally hacked the archbishop to death on the altar steps of his own cathedral. Christendom was aghast at the murder of an anointed prince of the church. Thomas was swiftly canonized as a martyr, and his shrine at Canterbury became a major pilgrimage site, immortalized by Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales. The penitent Henry was forced to do public penance, walking barefoot to the tomb and submitting to a symbolic scourging by the monks. And so Thomas Becket, the merchant's son, who began his journey as a common entertainer, ended it as a saint and a symbol of the eternal tug-of-war between church and state. It's a breathtaking arc, the stuff of legends, and a testament to the fluidity of medieval society where a man's wit and determination could propel him to the highest echelons of power. But for every shooting star like Becket, there were hundreds of nameless, forgotten minstrels eking out a precarious living on the roads of Europe. They were the medieval equivalent of starving artists, their lutes and fiddles in pawn, their next meal dependent on the generosity of strangers. Like modern buskers, they might sing for their supper outside a busy inn, or perform tricks in a marketplace, hoping to fill their hat with a few coins. If they were lucky, they might secure a position with a noble household, providing musical accompaniment for feasts and entertainments. But such gigs were not easy to come by. As the 15th century writer Robert Henryson lamented, "The life of a court minstrel is a tough one. To earn your keep, you must forever hold your tongue and play the perfect servant. Those who couldn't catch a patron's eye faced a wearying life of constant travel, their feet blistered from miles of trudging down dusty roads. They were at the mercy of the weather and the fickle whims of audiences. A minstrel who failed to please might find himself pelted with rotten vegetables or worse. Some faced stiff competition from more exotic entertainers, like acrobats and animal trainers. A French lord's account books record a payment of 3 gold écus to the man with the dancing bear, 5 écus to the Moor with the juggling ferrets, and a measly half écu to Jacques the balladeer. Poor Jacques, upstaged by ferrets. But for all their hardships, these wandering performers played a vital role in medieval society. In a time before mass media, they were the primary purveyors of news, carrying songs and stories from town to town. They helped to spread new ideas and fashions, along with the occasional bawdy joke. Their ballads and poems, passed down orally from generation to generation, are some of our only windows into the thoughts and feelings of ordinary medieval folk. Through their words, we can hear the voices of long-ago lovers, soldiers, rogues, and rebels, all those who history so often forgets. So the next time you pass a busker strumming on a street corner, give a thought to his medieval forebears and maybe toss a coin into his hat. In our own way, we're all minstrels, singing for our suppers in this great cosmic tavern. And who knows, you might just be funding the next Thomas Becket. Fair enough. Let us then turn our attention to the fascinating world of medieval festivals and fairs. These boisterous celebrations offered the common folk a much-needed respite from the daily grind, a chance to cut loose and indulge in revelry, if only for a fleeting few days. Imagine, if you will, the excited buzz that would build in a village as the annual fair approached. Travelling merchants and entertainers would begin to trickle in, their wagons laden with exotic wares and mysterious contraptions. The air would fill with the tantalizing aromas of roasting meats and sweet pastries. Brightly coloured banners would be unfurled and makeshift stages assembled in the town square. For the villagers, the fair represented a thrilling break from the monotony of their hard-scrabble existence. They could marvel at the strange beasts and human oddities in the menagerie, gasp at the death-defying acrobatics of troops like the Lords of Misrule, and be transfixed by the bawdy antics of mummers and minstrels. If they were feeling flush with coin, they might try their luck at games of chance, or indulge in a rare treat like a sugary dessert or a sip of spiced wine. But beyond the spectacle and indulgence, fairs also played a crucial role in the medieval economy. They were vital centres of trade, where merchants could peddle their wares and strike deals with buyers from far-flung regions. The most famous fairs, like the St. Bartholomew Fair in England or the Champagne Fairs in France, would draw traders from across Europe and beyond. For several heady weeks, the hosting town would be transformed into a bustling hub of commerce. Beneath a sea of colourful tents, you would find everything from fine Flemish cloth to Baltic amber, Damascus steel blades to intricate astrolabes. Deals would be hashed out, partnerships forged, and fortunes made and lost on the roll of a dice or the signing of a contract. But perhaps no medieval fair was as renowned for its unabashed merrymaking as the carnival celebrations hosted by the Dukes of Burgundy in the 15th century. These hedonistic affairs were the stuff of legend, towering banquet tables groaning under the weight of sumptuous feasts, fountains of wine, and riotous costumed balls that lasted until dawn. At the centre of these revels was Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy himself. A lover of luxury and spectacle, Philip would spare no expense in putting on the most extravagant festivities in all of Christendom. One infamous banquet in 1454, known as the Feast of the Pheasant, was held to drum up support for a new crusade against the Ottomans. The great hall was decked out like a fantastical pleasure garden, with gilded trees, artificial fountains, and an array of marvellous inventions like a mechanical pie filled with live birds. At the climax of the feast, an enormous pastry ship was wheeled out, and a giantess costumed as the Holy Church stepped out to beseech the gathered nobles to pledge themselves to the cause. Swept up in the pageantry and passion of the moment, Duke Philip made a grandiose vow to take up the cross and lead an army to reclaim Constantinople from the infidel. Alas, like so many crusading oaths, it was a promise that would never be fulfilled. Philip, despite his earnest piety, was forever entangled in the intrigues and rivalries of medieval realpolitik. But for that one shining evening, anything seemed possible. Saracens vanquished, the glories of a new Christian empire rising in the east. Such is the magic and power of medieval festivals in the popular imagination, both then and now. They offered a tantalizing escape from the often grim realities of life in those times, a chance to dream of brighter tomorrows. Even royalty would partake in the Fool's revelry from time to time. During the Feast of Fools held each January, a mock bishop would be elected from among the young clergy, donning ecclesiastical robes and presiding over a topsy-turvy mass filled with bawdy songs and general mischief. For a few anarchic days, the normal social order was gleefully upended. In England, a similar tradition saw a lord of misrule chosen to orchestrate Christmas mayhem in noble households. This merry prankster was given free rein to cause good-natured chaos, leading the servants in raucous songs, slapstick skits, and drunken dancing. Even the esteemed King Henry VIII was known to caper and carouse incognito at festivals during his younger years. Perhaps there is something eternally appealing about these temporary flights from the everyday, these socially sanctioned pressure valves. They speak to a fundamental human need to occasionally cast off the shackles of propriety and lose oneself in a bit of carefree merrymaking. From the raucous carnivals of medieval Europe to the wild Mardi Gras celebrations of today, we still delight in these festive detours from the daily grind. But alas, all good revels must come to an end, and so too must our whimsical journey through the annals of medieval entertainments draw to a close. As we bid farewell to the jousting knights and carousing jesters, the mischievous mummers and marvellous minstrels, let us tip our hats to the enduring ingenuity of the human spirit. For even in the face of tremendous hardship and strife, our medieval forebears found endlessly inventive ways to enliven their days with fun and folly. May we all strive to bring a bit more of their playful resourcefulness into our modern lives, to fill our days with life-affirming laughter and wonder at every opportunity. And with that gentle reminder, dear viewer, I bid you good night. Sweet dreams of spirited lute strumming and salty tavern tales to you all. You make an excellent point about the importance of fairs to the medieval economy. The great seasonal trade fairs served as vital commercial hubs, attracting merchants and customers from far and wide. These vibrant gatherings were not only crucial for conducting business, but also provided rare opportunities for people to socialize, be entertained, and experience a bustling atmosphere so different from the usual pace of medieval life. One of the largest and most famous of these events was the Stourbridge Fair, held annually near the town of Cambridge, England. Originating way back in the early 1200s as a local gathering for farmers and tradesmen, the fair steadily grew over the centuries in both size and significance. By the late Middle Ages, merchants came from all over England and even from continental Europe to attend the Stourbridge Fair. For nearly a month from late August to late September, the normally quiet meadows outside Cambridge transformed into a vast tented city alive with commerce and revelry. A Spanish visitor to the fair in the 1400s marvelled at the endless rows of stalls selling all manner of goods. Fine textiles, precious spices, handcrafted wares, barrels of wine and ale. It was like the entire world of trade condensed into a single time and place. Just imagine the sights and sounds of this sprawling fair at its peak. Everywhere, merchants and vendors would be calling out their wares, enticing passers-by. Silks and satins, velvets and lace, the finest fabrics from Italy and the East. Spices from distant lands, cinnamon, pepper, cloves, fit for a king's table. Mead as golden as the sun, ale as dark as night, wines to lift the spirit. Mingling with the shouts of sellers was the clamour of countless voices, haggling over prices in a dozen languages and accents. The pungent scent of exotic spices mixed with the earthy smells of livestock, hay, and wood smoke from the food stalls. Minstrels and acrobats wove through the throngs, adding flashes of colour and music to the bustling scene. The fair was also famous for its many entertainments. Troupes of actors staged mystery plays, religious dramas depicting biblical stories. Puppeteers, jugglers, and acrobats performed to the delight of children and adults alike. And of course, there was the raucous temporary district of taverns, alehouses, and gaming dens that catered to the fair's visitors. But the Stourbridge Fair was more than just a giant party. It played a vital economic role. For many merchants and tradesmen, the money they made at this fair could sustain them for the rest of the year. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge relied on the Stourbridge Fair as a major source for the year's supplies, and the tax revenues collected at the fair swelled the king's coffers as well. Unfortunately, like many aspects of medieval life, attending a major fair could also be hazardous. Outbreaks of disease sometimes spread rapidly in the crowded conditions. Fires posed a constant danger in the close-packed temporary stall cities. And the large concentrations of wealth inevitably drew thieves and scammers. To help keep order and settle disputes, a special court known as the Court of Pie Powders was set up at most large fairs. This rather strange name comes from the French pieds poudrés, meaning dusty feet, likely referring to the throngs of fairgoers stirring up the dirt. These temporary courts, based on merchant law, allowed for swift resolution of conflicts that arose during the fair. As the Middle Ages gave way to the early modern era in the 1500s and 1600s, the Stourbridge Fair gradually declined from its former preeminence. The growth of London as England's dominant commercial centre, increasing international maritime trade, and the advent of shops open year-round all contributed to its demise. By the 1700s, the once mighty fair had dwindled to a shadow of its former self before vanishing altogether. But for several centuries, the Stourbridge Fair reigned as the indisputable highlight of the medieval English trade calendar. A whirling, sprawling, riotous mélange of high commerce and lowbrow amusements, where for a few glorious weeks the usual rules and rhythms of life were suspended. It must have been an incredible spectacle to behold, a grand finale to the fleeting warm days before the onset of another long, lean winter. As we draw near the end of our look at the wild world of medieval pastimes and entertainments, it's fascinating to consider just how important a role these festivities played in the lives of people long ago. From spirited jousts to dizzying trade fairs, they offered not just diversion, but real meaning and much-needed breaks from the unrelenting labour and hardships that most endured. In a time before mass communication and easy travel, events like tournaments and festivals were cherished chances to come together as a community, to experience something new and exciting. The pageantry of a joust, the sensory overload of a fair, the bawdy antics of a jester. These joys were all the sweeter for their rarity. Of course, as with many aspects of history, we have to be careful not to over-romanticize the past. For the vast majority of people, leisure time was a luxury and daily survival a constant struggle. Many of the entertainments we've discussed were largely the preserve of the wealthy and privileged, and even the fun could be rough. Injuries and deaths were common at tournaments, and drunken brawls a regular occurrence at fairs. But that makes the resilience and ingenuity of medieval people all the more remarkable. In a world so full of obstacles and adversity, they still found ways to come together and celebrate, to infuse their difficult lives with colour and excitement. Just like people in every place and period of history, they showed that indomitable human urge to make meaning and seek joy, even in the unlikeliest of circumstances. So while it's easy to dismiss the Middle Ages as a backward, barbaric time, the truth is always more complex. The more we learn about the beliefs, struggles, and daily experiences of medieval people, the more we may recognise some of our own hopes and fears reflected back at us. At the end of the day, across the vast gulf of centuries, they were not so different from us. Just humans doing their best with the lot they were given, finding what joy and meaning they could along the way. And if our modern world, with all its wonders and conveniences, should ever feel too frenetic or frayed, perhaps we could learn a thing or two from our medieval ancestors about the simple pleasures of a bawdy story well told, or a lively tune played on a humble lute under an open sky. But for now, the sights and sounds of our imaginary Stourbridge Fair begin to gently recede as weariness draws its soft cloak about us. The bright banners and tents fade into twilight shadows, the shouts and laughter of the fairgoers, muffled to a distant murmur. Rest now, weary time traveller, and may your dreams be filled with the vivid colours and merry melodies of a world long past, but never truly lost. Good night. The nobility also enjoyed lavish feasts and banquets, which were a chance to showcase their wealth, power, and sophisticated tastes. The great halls of castles and manors would be decked out with embroidered tapestries, gleaming candelabras, and long tables covered in white linen. The guests, dressed in their finest attire, would be seated according to their rank, with the host and most important personages at the high table. The kitchens would be a hive of activity, with dozens of cooks, scullions, and servers preparing a dizzying array of dishes. A typical feast might start with a first course of soups, stews, and savoury tarts, followed by a main course of roasted meats like venison, wild boar, swan, and peacock, often presented in elaborate displays with their feathers reattached. Alongside the meats, there would be a variety of side dishes, including freshwater fish, eels, lobster, oysters, salads, and a plethora of vegetables like peas, asparagus, and artichokes. The finest delicacies were flavoured with exotic and expensive spices like saffron, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg, which were imported from distant lands at great cost. Diners would eat off of trenchers, which were flat rounds of stale bread that served as an edible plate. They would use their personal knife to spear food from the common serving dishes, and their fingers to convey it to their mouth. Forks were not in common use yet. Between courses, the trenchers would be given as alms to the poor. Wine, ale, and mead flowed freely from ornate goblets and drinking horns. A royal feast could feature up to 7 courses and last for many hours, often with musicians, jesters, and other entertainments between the courses. It was considered the height of refinement and courtesy for a lord to offer a particularly choice morsel of food to an honoured guest with his own knife. One of the most lavish and legendary feasts of the medieval period was the Feast of the Pheasant, hosted by Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, in 1454. The occasion was Philip's declaration of his intent to go on a crusade against the Ottomans, who had recently captured Constantinople. The banquet featured a series of elaborate entremets, or sculpted foods that served as table decorations and conveyed allegorical messages. There was a large pudding in the shape of a castle with the banners of the Ottoman Sultan, which Philip dramatically sliced into. There was a giant pie from which burst 28 musicians dressed as birds when it was cut open. The table also featured a statue of a naked woman crying tears of rosewater in supplication for the defense of Constantinople. Each course was served to the accompaniment of pageants, songs, and dramatic readings celebrating the chivalric valor of going on crusade. At the high point of the feast, a live pheasant was brought in, elaborately decorated with a gold collar and jewels. Philip and his fellow lords made solemn vows on the pheasant to fight the infidel. Ironically, despite all the pomp and ceremony, Philip never actually went on crusade, as he was too preoccupied with enlarging his own territories. The Feast of the Pheasant exemplified the late medieval style of courtly opulence and pageantry. Such occasions were designed to dazzle the senses and showcase the wealth and power of the nobility. They were also highly symbolic, with each decorative element and figure conveying a story or moral lesson. The birds bursting out of pies represented the souls being freed from the torments of purgatory. The woman weeping rosewater tears embodied the anguish of Christians suffering under Ottoman rule. Despite their extravagance, medieval banquets could also be quite unhygienic affairs by modern standards. The rush floors of the great halls were often littered with bones, spilled food and drink, and even dog droppings from the lord's hunting hounds lounging under the tables. The elaborate displays of dressed-up animals like peacocks with all their plumage would be left out for hours, becoming a breeding ground for bacteria. and the communal washing of hands in shared basins of water before and after the meal did little to prevent the spread of disease. Amidst all the excess and grandeur of noble feasts, one quiet revolutionary was laying the foundations of modern French cuisine. Guillaume Tirel, better known as Taillevent, served as master chef to no less than 3 French kings, Philip VI, Charles V, and Charles VI, between 1326 to 1395. Taillevent's reputation was such that he was placed in charge of organising the coronation feast of Charles V in 1364, which featured a staggering array of 66 dishes divided into 3 courses. Taillevent is most famous for writing one of the earliest medieval cookbooks called Le Viandier, which contained 230 recipes ranging from simple dishes like omelettes and vegetable soups to complex preparations of venison, boar, and other game meats. Taillevent emphasized the importance of fresh ingredients, careful seasoning, and attractive presentation. He also began to codify the elaborate rituals and protocols of formal dining, such as the progression of courses, the pairing of dishes with sauces, and the art of carving meats. Some of Taillevent's recipes seem strange and unappealing to modern tastes, such as the garbage, which was a stew made from the entrails and offal of various animals. Another dish was momigny, which was a sweet and savoury porridge of wheat, almonds, rice, cinnamon, saffron and sugar, often dyed a vivid green colour with parsley juice. The most infamous was cockentrice, a Frankenstein-esque creation made by stitching together the upper half of a capon with the bottom half of a piglet and coating it in egg yolk and saffron before roasting. However, many of Taillevent's other recipes and techniques were well ahead of their time and laid the groundwork for the development of haute cuisine. He was one of the first chefs to recommend using butter and heavy cream to enrich and thicken sauces. He developed a precursor to the roux, the foundational mixture of butter and flour used to make sauces like béchamel and velouté. Taillevent's blanc manger, a creamy almond-flavoured chicken stew thickened with rice flour, anticipated the more refined blanc mangers of the 17th and 18th centuries made with milk and sugar. He pioneered new pâtés, terrines, and the use of the pastry crust as a decorative container for savoury fillings like meat and cheese. In a sense, Taillevent was one of the world's first celebrity chefs, renowned for his artistry and skill, and setting the standard for generations of cooks to come after him. Even outside of royal courts and noble manors, the rising middle class of medieval towns and cities enjoyed good food and conviviality at taverns and inns. A typical tavern meal might include a savoury pottage or stew, bread, pickled vegetables, and simple roasted meats or fish, all washed down with plenty of ale or cider. Taverns were also social hubs, where people would gather to exchange news, sing songs, and play various games. Dice games were especially popular, including early versions of craps and hazard. Other common games included nine men's Morris, fox and geese, tables, an early form of backgammon, and chess. Chess was considered the most intellectually challenging and prestigious of the medieval games, the so-called Game of Kings. It was a favourite pastime of nobles, scholars and clergy, who would often engage in matches for high-stakes wagers. The Lewis chessmen are perhaps the most famous surviving medieval chess pieces, discovered on the Isle of Lewis off the coast of Scotland in 1831. The hoard contained 93 game pieces in total, including kings, queens, bishops, knights and pawns, intricately carved from walrus ivory and whale's teeth in the elaborate Romanesque style of the 12th century. Most of the pieces are housed in the British Museum, with a few held at the National Museum of Scotland. The Lewis chessmen capture the vibrant and imaginative spirit of medieval craftsmen. The kings sit slouched on their thrones, wearing dour expressions and holding their swords across their laps. The knights are mounted on small ponies, their eyes bulging with fierce concentration. The rooks or warders are depicted as wild-eyed berserker warriors biting the tops of their shields in battle frenzy. Scholars believe the chessmen were likely crafted in Trondheim, Norway, between 1150 to 1200 AD. At that time, the Isle of Lewis was part of the Kingdom of Norway, and the presence of such a rich hoard suggests it may have belonged to a high-ranking noble who was travelling through the area. Archaeologists speculate that the chessmen may have been concealed during a shipwreck or buried by a merchant en route to trading markets in Ireland. The Lewis chessmen are not only exquisite works of art, but also a window into the popular pastimes and material culture of the medieval nobility. Chess was more than just a frivolous game. It was seen as a way to sharpen strategic thinking, hone courtly graces, and display cultured tastes. Possessing an ornate set of chessmen carved from expensive materials like ivory was a mark of social status and prestige. One of the most chess-obsessed medieval monarchs was King Alfonso X of Castile, also known as Alfonso the Wise. Alfonso was a renowned scholar and patron of the arts, who wrote extensively on a wide range of topics, including science, law, history, and music. In 1283, he commissioned the production of a lavishly illustrated manuscript called the Book of Games, or Libro de los Juegos, in Spanish. The Book of Games is one of the most important sources we have on medieval games and their rules. It contains 97 pages of detailed descriptions and colour illustrations of various games, primarily chess, dice, and tables. The chess problems in particular are highly advanced and complex, attesting to Alfonso's skill and passion for the game. Interestingly, the book also includes astrological charts linking certain dice rolls to the influence of the planets and the zodiac. This reflects the medieval belief in the interconnectedness of all aspects of the cosmos and how even seemingly random games of chance could be imbued with deeper symbolic meaning. Alfonso was not alone in his love of gambling. Many medieval nobles were notorious for their high-stakes wagers on games of dice, cards, and chess. In 1254, King Louis IX of France had to ban gambling on the Crusades because too many of his soldiers were losing their money and arms. In England, King Henry VIII was known to lose vast sums at dice and cards, contributing to the depletion of the royal treasury. Perhaps the most extravagant expression of the medieval passion for gambling was the ridotto, or private gambling house, established in Venice in 1638. The ridotto was essentially an early casino, featuring various rooms and tables for playing games like bezzetta, biribi, and dice. It catered to the wealthy nobility and was famous for its opulent decor with gilded mirrors, plush carpets, and frescoed ceilings. The ridotto set the stage for the development of casinos and gambling resorts in the modern era. But it also reflects the timeless human fascination with games of chance and skill, the thrill of risk and reward, and the desire to test one's luck and prowess against others. From the humblest tavern dice games to the Game of Kings, played with ornate ivory chessmen, medieval pastimes reveal the ingenuity and playfulness of the human spirit across the ages. Of course, no medieval nobleman's prestige was complete without a love of hunting, the true sport of kings. Hunting was not just a recreational pastime, but also an important symbolic ritual that affirmed rank, martial prowess, and dominion over nature. Great lords maintained vast hunting parks called forests, chases, or warrens, where they alone had the right to hunt game like deer, boar, and hare. These parks were patrolled by gamekeepers and foresters who prevented poaching by commoners on pain of severe punishment. A nobleman's hunting retinue was a microcosm of the medieval social order. At the top was the lord himself, often on horseback, armed with a sword, lance, or bow. Then came his huntsmen, prickers, and yeomen, each with their specialized roles and distinctive livery. The huntsmen, also called burners, handled the hounds. The big, powerful raches and alontes used to chase and bring down the quarry. Prickers were mounted hunters who rode ahead to flush out game with horns and cries of "Hike a Talbot," "Hike a Beaumont." Lower in status were the unmounted yeomen armed with boar spears and quarterstaffs, and the beaters who drove prey out of the underbrush with staves and rattles. At the bottom were the humble trencher hounds who served as food tasters and disposers of offal and carrion. Strict codes and rituals governed every noble hunt. The type of game hunted, the weapons used, and even the cuts of meat one was entitled to all depended on one's place in the feudal hierarchy. A lord was expected to know the proper terminology for every aspect of the hunt, from the fumets or droppings of the heart to the curie, the elaborate butchering and feeding of the carcass to the hounds. Few lords were more passionate about hunting than Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Philip was a larger-than-life figure who embodied the pageantry and excess of the Burgundian court in the 14th century. He inherited one of the largest and richest duchies in Europe, encompassing not just Burgundy, but also Flanders, Brabant, and Holland. Philip used his vast wealth to indulge his love of fine art, music, tournaments, and above all, the thrill of the chase. Philip's court was renowned for its opulence and spectacle, with lavish banquets, masques, and entertainments. But it was his hunting expeditions that truly showcased his power and prestige. The Duke's hunting retinue could number over 1,000 men, with hundreds of hounds, horses, and hawks. They would set out in a vast, colourful procession, with trumpets blaring and banners snapping in the wind, led by Philip himself in resplendent hunting attire. One of Philip's favourite hunting grounds was the forest of Crécy, near his castle of Hesdin in Picardy. There, in 1387, Philip hosted a legendary hunting party for his brother King Charles VI of France and his uncles the Dukes of Berry and Bourbon. The forest was stocked with a staggering array of game, including deer, boar, wolves, foxes, hares, and birds. The hunters rode out at dawn, divided into 4 parties, each led by one of the royal dukes. Philip, as the host, had the privilege of leading the first chase. According to the chronicler Jean Froissart, the duke's hounds quickly flushed out a hart of 10, a magnificent stag which led them on a wild chase through the forest. The hart finally sought refuge in a small pond, where it was surrounded by the baying hounds. But rather than let the hounds make the kill, Philip dismounted and approached the stag on foot, lance in hand. In a show of martial valour, he dispatched the hart with a single thrust of his spear, to the cheers of his fellow hunters. The bloody carcass was then carried back to the castle in a triumphal procession, to be butchered and served at the evening banquet in Philip's great hall. This ritual of personally killing the stag was deeply significant in medieval hunting culture. It was a symbolic reenactment of the mythical chase of the white stag, an elusive, almost supernatural creature that led the hunter into the enchanted realm of the forest. Slaying the stag was seen as a test of courage, skill, and virility, a way for a lord to prove his worth as a warrior and a man. For Philip, the art of hunting was inseparable from the art of war. He was a fierce and canny military commander who fought in some of the most important battles of the 100 Years' War between England and France. In 1382, Philip led the French army to a decisive victory over the rebellious weavers and artisans of Flanders at the Battle of Rosbecque. He was also a key player in the complex web of negotiations, marriages, and treaties that shaped the political landscape of late medieval Europe. But perhaps Philip's greatest legacy was his role in transforming Burgundy into a cultural and artistic powerhouse that rivaled the great city-states of Italy. He patronised some of the most celebrated Flemish artists of the day, including the sculptor Klaus Sluter and the painter Melchior Brudelam. The illuminated manuscripts, tapestries, and goldsmiths' work, commissioned by Philip's court, set a new standard of virtuosity and sophistication. This opulence reached its apex in Philip's grandson, Philip the Good, and his legendary Feast of the Pheasant, which we described earlier. But Philip the Bold set the stage for Burgundy's cultural ascendancy through his savvy blend of martial prowess, political cunning, and artistic patronage. The rituals of the hunt were an essential part of this package, projecting an image of noble power and prestige that dazzled contemporaries and echoed through the ages. Of course, hunting was not just the preserve of great dukes and kings. Let's continue our foray into the wild world of medieval leisure and pleasure. But before we get too carried away, I must caution that the nobility tended to have all the fun, while life was no carnival for the toiling peasants. You see, 90% of the population were serfs, virtual slaves bound to the land, breaking their backs to grow food for the other 10%, those lucky, plucky nobles. Even so, the commoners found time between back-breaking labour for a few simple amusements of their own. I suppose you could say they were experts at making their own fun. Imagine yourself a humble medieval peasant. If you weren't busy tilling the fields, slopping the hogs, or darning your only ragged tunic, you might steal a few precious moments to play Nine Men's Morris, a deceptively simple yet absorbing board game played with pebbles and sticks. No fancy-dancy PlayStation 5 required, just a slab of wood and a pocket full of rocks. Chess was another favourite, and archaeological evidence shows it crossed all social classes. From haughty lords to lowly serfs, everyone loved a good game of chess. But the most magnificent chess set of the Middle Ages has to be the Lewis chessman, discovered by a farmer on the remote Isle of Lewis off the coast of Scotland in 1831. Carved from walrus ivory and whale teeth in the 12th century, these expressive little kings, queens, bishops and knights are a marvel to behold. Just who owned this exquisite set remains a tantalizing mystery lost to time. Some speculate a merchant was carrying them to a lucrative sale when his ship foundered near Lewis. Imagine the look on his face as his precious cargo plummeted to the bottom of the sea. But they were not doomed to a watery grave forever. Only about 700 years or so before being miraculously resurrected. But I digress, so back to our poor beleaguered peasants. They couldn't afford walrus tusk chessmen, but that didn't stop them from having a jolly good time rolling the dice. In fact, gambling was a favourite pastime of all classes. So much so that one irate 13th century preacher railed against the damnable art of dice play, fearing it would corrupt the youth into sloth and depravity. But no matter how the preacher prattled on, dicing was devilishly popular. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are chock full of gambling references. Those merry pilgrims just couldn't wait to get to the next inn to try their luck at hazard, or put their pennies on a pair of six. Even kings and bishops would lay a wager or two on the toss of the knuckle bones, the forerunner of dice made from actual animal knuckles. But gambling wasn't just a harmless hobby. It could be downright dangerous in the Middle Ages. In 1190, the King of France and the King of England got into a row over a particularly heated dice game and nearly came to blows. Talk about royal temper tantrums. One can only imagine the poor quaking page who had to break up that spat. But it seems the French never learned their lesson. A few centuries later, King Henry IV of France once lost an entire district of Paris in a single roll of the dice. Now that's what I call high-stakes gambling. Indeed, such wagers could have far-reaching consequences. According to medieval chroniclers, the region of Mortain in Normandy got its name from a very unlucky throw of the dice. The story goes that William of Normandy lost the county to his brother Robert during a game and exclaimed in French, "Mal tien," meaning badly held. Whether a tall tale or true story, it certainly proves that when it came to dicing, the stakes didn't get much higher than a chunk of the duchy. But for those wishing to avoid flashing daggers over the hazard table, a friendly game of tables was just the ticket. An ancestor of our modern backgammon, this ancient game was hugely popular across medieval Europe, from London to Constantinople. The Book of Games, commissioned by King Alfonso X of Castile, depicts bejeweled nobles and turbaned Moors hunched in studious concentration over their boards. One can almost hear the satisfying rattle of the dice and click-clack of the pieces. Curiously, many surviving sets have a lopsided number of counters, perhaps to give a skilled player a winning edge over a well-heeled but half-witted opponent. But you may be wondering, with all this talk of gambling, where did medieval folk go to get their game on? Why, the local tavern, of course. These dingy, smoky dens served up hearty helpings of ale, gossip, and gaming galore. Forget the jousts and tournaments. This is where the real action happened. Imagine a cramped, dimly lit room packed with boisterous patrons. A virtual rogues gallery of cut purses, sailors, apprentices, and wayward clerics, their faces flickering in the light of guttering tallow candles. In one corner, a grizzled man-at-arms rolls his remaining dice with a trembling hand, the last of his wages riding on this final toss. In another, a group of rascally students cluster over a game of fox and geese, their whoops of triumph and howls of despair punctuating the merry din. The harried tavern keeper scurries to and fro with foaming flagons of ale, pausing only to cuff the ears of a stable boy filching hazelnuts from a bowl. Yes, it's a far cry from the glittering castle banquet hall, but you can't beat it for a good night out. But man cannot subsist on dice alone, so all this gaming would work up a mighty hunger and powerful thirst. No worries though, for the average tavern offered a lip-smacking array of hearty fare to keep those gamblers going. A typical spread might include crusty manchette bread, zesty cheese, and perhaps a leek pottage, all washed down with quarts of strong brown ale. And if you were feeling particularly flush, you might splash out on a roasted capon or savoury meat pie. Just be sure to keep one eye on your trencher and the other on your purse, lest some light-fingered rogue make off with your supper or your steaks. But I fear I may have painted too sordid a picture of the medieval tavern. To be sure, many were upstanding establishments frequented by honest working folk, just looking to unwind after a hard day's toil. Why even the most respectable craftsman would gather to hoist a pint, swap tales, and yes, enjoy a friendly game or three. The tailor might try his hand against the cooper, the girdler against the glover, their good-natured ribbing and occasional oaths echoing into the wee hours. But gaming wasn't the only entertainment on offer at your local medieval watering hole. If you were lucky, a wandering minstrel might drop by to ply his trade, brightening up the evening with sprightly tunes and stirring tales of heroic deeds. A skill recounting of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight could make you forget the flea bites and watered-down wine, for a little while anyway. Other nights, you might be treated to the antics of a jester or a troupe of tumblers, their daring acrobatics and ribald japes coaxing chuckles and cheers from even the most dour-faced patrons. Of course, such diversions were not without risk. One false move, and an ambitious acrobat could wind up face first in a patron's pottage. I imagine more than one vacationing pope or lofty lord found himself wearing his soup after a juggling feat gone awry. But no form of medieval tavern entertainment could top the spectacle of the dancing bear. That's right, for a few coins, you could watch a shaggy, hulking beast lumber and sway to the mournful strains of a hurdy-gurdy. Just how the bear felt about his part in the act remains an historical mystery, but one suspects even the promise of a sticky bun or two failed to erase the indignity of it all. Indeed, animal welfare was not exactly top priority in the Middle Ages, but tavern bears were downright domesticated compared to the ferocious creatures stalked by noble hunters in the wild woods beyond the castle walls. Oh yes, hunting was the sport of kings and princes long before polo ponies and cricket bats, and any self-respecting medieval monarch worth his salt kept a well-stocked hunting lodge or two. Imagine yourself a guest at one of these rustic yet luxurious retreats. After a night spent on goose-down mattresses and Flemish lace sheets, you rise at dawn to join the royal hunting party. Outside, dozens of keen-nosed hounds strain at their leashes, their barks and bays shattering the misty morning calm. Liveried pages scurry to and fro bearing gleaming hunting horns and tooled leather saddles. And what a resplendent sight are the nobles themselves in their fur-trimmed cloaks and rich velvet gowns. But don't be fooled by all the pomp and pageantry. This is no pony ride in the park. A medieval hunt was a hardcore, often dangerous affair. You see, the nobles weren't tracking bunnies and badgers. Oh no, they were going after savage wild boar, fierce bears, and swift, deadly stags. Those picturesque tapestries of dainty lords and ladies prancing after a fluffy, snow-white unicorn. Pure poppycock propaganda spun by wily craftsmen looking to line their pockets with ducats from doe-eyed damsels. No, if you really wanted to impress your noble buddies, you set your sights on big game. The bigger and meaner, the better. Why even kings and popes got in on the action. In 1461, King Louis XI of France threw down the gauntlet to the Duke of Burgundy, challenging his rival to a boar-slaying contest. Now that's what I call Royal Rumble. Eat your heart out WrestleMania. But it wasn't just two-legged prey that medieval hunters had to watch out for. Many an overconfident young noble found himself gored by a raging boar or mauled by a grumpy bear. In 1477, the Duchess Mary of Burgundy, flushed with the thrill of the chase, took a nasty tumble from her horse and broke her back. She died 2 short days later at the tender age of 25. I suppose you could say curiosity killed the Duchess. Now I bet you're thinking hunting was just another macho pastime for manly, meat-loving men. Well, think again. Some of the most celebrated hunters of the Middle Ages were women. Take Queen Elizabeth of York, for example. This 15th century huntress was renowned for her skill with a crossbow and could shoot a stag through the eye at 200 paces. Now that's what I call a deadeye. But no medieval huntress could top the exploits of Margaret of Anjou, the fearsome 15th century Queen of England. This indomitable lady was an avid hunter and formidable warrior, personally leading her troops into battle during the Wars of the Roses. It was said she could track a hart through a moonless night and once took down a charging boar with a single thrust of her spear. Forget Queen of Hearts. This was the Queen of Hunting. Of course, not everyone had the stomach for such blood-pumping exploits. For those who preferred their thrills without the spills, there was always the muse. No, I'm not talking about the sound a kitten makes, but rather the medieval version of a falconry centre. Here, noble lords and ladies could experience the rush of the hunt from the comfort of a shady garden or castle terrace. Imagine whiling away a lazy afternoon, watching your favourite goshawk or peregrine falcon wheel and soar through the cloudless sky, then plummet like a thunderbolt upon some hapless hare or quail. Falconry was the Ferrari of the Middle Ages, flashy, expensive, and oh so thrilling. But like a high-performance sports car, a falconry bird required constant care and attention. A large royal mews might employ dozens of falconers, each tasked with training and tending to a particular bird. It was a delicate art, requiring patience, skill, and nerves of steel. After all, one false move, and you could find yourself at the business end of a razor-sharp beak or set of talons. But for those who could afford it, falconry was the ultimate status symbol. Why, a prized gear falcon from Greenland or Iceland could set you back the equivalent of a small castle. But it was money well spent, for a noble with a falcon perched on his fist was sure to turn heads at court. Why even Shakespeare name-dropped the sport in his plays. A sure sign it was the talk of the town. But as with so many medieval pastimes, falconry was not without its risks. In 1500, King Louis XII of France was out hawking with his courtiers when his prized bird was attacked by a pair of eagles. In the ensuing aerial dogfight, the king was accidentally struck by a stray talon and blinded in one eye. Now that's what I call a royal hunting accident. but I fear I may have given you the impression that medieval falconry was all pomp and pageantry. In truth, it served a vital role in putting food on the royal table. You see, falcons were the guided missiles of the Middle Ages, capable of taking down fast-flying game birds like ducks and partridges that were difficult to catch with traditional hunting methods. Why, a skilled falcon could snatch a plump goose right out of the sky. A welcome addition to any medieval feast. Ah, but we mustn't forget the real stars of the show, the birds themselves. From the majestic gerfalcon to the nimble merlin, these feathered hunters were the pride and joy of any medieval muse. But perhaps none was more prized than the peregrine falcon, a sleek, swift predator that could reach speeds of over 200 miles per hour in a high-speed dive known as a stoop. Watching one of these magnificent birds plummet from the heavens to strike its quarry was a sight that would make even the most jaded noble's heart skip a beat. But as much as the nobles loved their falcons, they weren't above a little friendly competition. Falconry contests were a popular pastime, with nobles vying to see whose bird could take the most game or perform the most dazzling aerial maneuvers. Why, in 1390, King Richard II of England organised a grand falconry tournament to celebrate his marriage to Anne of Bohemia. Lords and ladies from across the realm flocked to the event, each hoping to win the coveted prize, a solid gold falcon hood encrusted with precious gems. But while falconry was a sport fit for a king, it wasn't the only winged wonder to capture the medieval imagination. No, for some, nothing could beat the majestic sight of a mighty swan gliding across a glassy moat. But don't let their serene beauty fool you. In the Middle Ages, swans were serious business. You see, all swans were property of the crown, and woe betide any peasant caught poaching one for their pot. Why, in 1482, a hapless farmer was hanged for killing a swan that had been eating his crops. I suppose you could say it was a case of duck, goose, swan. But not all medieval bird lovers were so bloodthirsty. In fact, some preferred to keep their feathered friends closer to home. Songbirds like nightingales, linnets, and goldfinches were popular pets among the nobility, prized for their sweet voices and colourful plumage. Why, even nuns and monks got in on the action, keeping finches and canaries to brighten up their cloisters with a little bird song. But perhaps the most famous medieval bird lover of all was St. Francis of Assisi. This gentle Italian friar was renowned for his love of all God's creatures, great and small. Legend has it that he once preached a sermon to a flock of attentive birds, exhorting them to praise their creator with their songs. Now that's what I call a bird-brained idea. But I digress. You're probably wondering what all this talk of hawks and swans has to do with medieval entertainment. Well, you see, falconry and bird-keeping were just two of the many ways that medieval folk found beauty and wonder in the natural world. In a time before zoos and wildlife documentaries, the creatures of forest and field held a special fascination for people of all classes. Why, even the humble hedgehog had its moment in the medieval sun. Yes, you heard me right. The hedgehog. In the Middle Ages, these spiky little insectivores were believed to have all sorts of magical powers. Some folk kept them as pets, believing they could ward off evil spirits and cure everything from baldness to bubonic plague. Others used their quills to make charms and amulets, or even ground them up into potions and powders. But perhaps the most bizarre hedgehog-related pastime was the sport of urchin rolling. Competitors would roll a live hedgehog down a hill and place bets on how far it would go before unrolling itself. Now that's what I call a prickly situation. I can only imagine the hedgehog's relief when it finally came to a stop, quills quivering with indignation. But lest you think the Middle Ages were all fun and games, let us not forget the grim realities of life. Through games of chance and skill, medieval people of all walks of life found ways to test their luck and stave off boredom. From the lowliest taverns to the halls of grand castles, The clatter of dice and chess pieces provided a lively soundtrack to medieval life. Perhaps the most famous gaming relics to survive from the Middle Ages are the Lewis chessmen. This intricately carved set of walrus ivory chess pieces was discovered on the Isle of Lewis, off the coast of Scotland, in 1831. 93 pieces from 4 distinct sets were found, although who they belonged to remains a captivating mystery, lost to time. The Lewis chessmen are believed to have been made in Trondheim, Norway in the 12th century, based on their ornate Romanesque style. The kings, queens, bishops, knights and warders are depicted as solemn figures, sitting with swords across their laps or grasping their faces deep in thought. One can imagine a wealthy Norwegian noble commissioning the set, only to have them go missing on a voyage across the sea. The superstitious crew perhaps casting the idolatrous chessmen overboard. In the smoky din of a medieval tavern, chess was just one of many games of strategy that mingled with raucous dice games and rounds of backgammon or tables. Archaeologists have uncovered boards scratched into the tops of barrels and benches, a sign of just how ubiquitous such pastimes were. The medieval version of Nine Men's Morris, played with pegs or stones on a board or dirt grid, was so popular that countless boards survive scratched into cloister seats and even the porches of cathedrals. But for sheer variety, few could match the gaming habits of King Alfonso X of Castile. The learned king, also known as Alfonso the Wise, commissioned an impressive tome called the Libro de los Juegos, or Book of Games, in 1283. The book depicts the rules of chess, dice, and tables, accompanied by lavish illustrations of players engaged in the games. One memorable anecdote tells of a tense chess game between King Henry I of England and Louis VI of France in 1119. The two monarchs sat hunched over the board, each determined to outmaneuver the other. But when Louis triumphed, Henry, in a fit of kingly rage, flung the chessboard at Louis's head, drawing blood. A century later, chess again sparked an international incident when Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus of France got into a scuffle over a wager on a game. Clearly, medieval notions of being a good sport had their limits. For those craving the atmosphere of a casino, one needed only to visit medieval Venice. It was there that the Gluckhaus or ridotto first emerged in the 13th century. These little houses of luck were early gambling halls where dice games and card games were played for high stakes. Situated in private wings of palazzos, the well-heeled patrons of the ridotto lounged on Turkish carpets, played games like tarot and primero, and enjoyed sweetmeats and chilled wine between turns. But of course, man cannot live on gaming alone. The medieval nobility had more refined tastes when it came to leisure, and nothing was more synonymous with their privileged status than the thrill of the hunt. Hunting was far more than a mere pastime for the nobility. It was an all-encompassing way of life, one deeply entwined with prestige, pageantry, and power. Few exemplified the medieval aristocratic love of the hunt more than Mary of Burgundy. The Duchess of Burgundy, Mary was one of the wealthiest women in Europe, renowned for her patronage of the arts. But above all, Mary adored hunting and falconry. As an expert rider and hawk trainer, she thought nothing of spending long days in the saddle pursuing quarry. Tragically, Mary's life was cut short at the age of 25 when she insisted on riding out to hunt just weeks after a difficult childbirth. Galloping through the forest, her horse tripped and Mary was thrown against a tree, breaking her back. She languished in agony for days before finally succumbing to her injuries. The whole of Burgundy mourned their vivacious, sports-loving duchess. A medieval noble hunt was a grand affair, a portable festival that unfolded across the landscape. A sea of colourful silk tents and pavilions would spring up in forest clearings, with portable tapestries and furnishings transforming the rustic camps into something fit for aristocratic tastes. The chief huntsman, or master of game, oversaw a small army of foresters, dog handlers, and beaters, who worked to drive deer and boar within range of the noble hunters. The protocol of the hunt was deeply serious to the medieval nobility, with an elaborate system of rituals governing every aspect. Special hunting horns sounded unique calls for different prey or parts of the chase. At the end of a successful hunt, the hunters and hounds were honoured in a solemn ceremony. The deer's entrails and organs were spread out on its hide in a precise arrangement and offered to the dogs as a reward. But the spectacle of the noble hunt paled in comparison to the sheer exoticism and novelty of travelling entertainers. In a time long before Netflix, these roving troops of musicians, poets, acrobats and jugglers brought much-needed diversion to the farthest-flung corners of medieval Europe. Perhaps the most storied example of a performer turned power broker is Thomas Becket. Before becoming a man of the cloth, Becket served as a minstrel in the court of Theobald of Bec, the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 12th century. There, Becket's quick wit and lyrical talents caught the attention of King Henry II, who appointed him Lord Chancellor in 1155. Becket and Henry became inseparable friends, partners in youthful revels and shenanigans. But their relationship soured when Becket was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury and took his spiritual duties far more seriously than Henry had anticipated. The rift culminated in 1170 when, in a fit of rage, Henry allegedly cried, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 of Henry's knights took this as a royal command. They rode to Canterbury Cathedral, where they confronted Becket, drew their swords and brutally murdered him on the altar steps. Becket's shocking martyrdom reverberated throughout Christendom. Miracles were reported at his tomb, and Canterbury became a major pilgrimage site, forever linked to Becket's memory. Of course, few minstrels could dream of rising to such lofty heights, or suffering such a dramatic demise. For most, a life on the road was one of hardship and uncertainty, forever chasing the next meal or a dry place to lay one's head. They were the medieval equivalent of starving artists. A group of 12th century French troubadours found their meal ticket by carrying the new art form of courtly love poetry from castle to castle. Singing florid odes comparing their noble patronesses to goddesses, poets like Chrétien de Troyes gained fame and royal favour. It was de Troyes who composed the first tales of Lancelot, Percival, and the Holy Grail that would capture imaginations for centuries to come. But perhaps no medieval entertainer was so synonymous with providing a good time as the humble court jester. Forever clad in motley, these impudent funny men cartwheeled across castle halls and banquet tables, regaling lords and ladies with ribald jokes, clever puns, and acrobatic feats. A famous jester named Roland le Péteur was known for his ability to jump up onto his liege's table, steal a quick swig of wine, and backflip off without disturbing a single dish. Such antics provided a welcome steam valve, allowing sly criticism of the social order under the guise of foolery. In a world where a stray word could mean a trip to the gallows, the jester's role as a sanctioned speaker of truth to power was vital. But a few special times a year, the social order itself turned upside down. Medieval people eagerly looked forward to festival days as a respite from ceaseless toil. And no celebration threw open the doors to misrule and mayhem quite like Carnival. With roots in Roman winter revelries, Carnival flourished in medieval Europe as a final burst of excess before the privations of Lent. This farewell to flesh reached its most riotous heights in 15th century Burgundy under the Dukes Philip the Good and Charles the Bold. For days, the streets of Bruges and Ghent became one continuous party, with lavish parades, bonfires, and open-air feasts. Elaborate costumes allowed revelers to shed their everyday identities and indulge their wilder natures. Role reversals were common, with the poor dressing as priests or nobles and vice versa. A lord of misrule was often elected to serve as a mock ruler who gleefully parodied the decrees of church and state. Such egalitarian antics foreshadowed the Feast of Fools held each December, when a lowly boy bishop ruled over even the highest church officials. This carnival spirit of social inversion provided a safety valve, however brief, from the rigid medieval hierarchy. But carnival was not the only time when medieval people let loose. Trade fairs, vital to the medieval economy, doubled as raucous festivals, complete with sideshows and entertainments. Sprawling across town squares or open fields, fairs like England's St. Bartholomew Fair became known as a Bartholomew baby, for the sheer number of unplanned pregnancies that followed each year. For a few precious days, peasants and nobles alike browsed stalls piled high with Flemish woolens, Venetian glassware, and exotic spices. They gaped at performing animals and hired freak shows. They guffawed at bawdy farces and mystery plays performed by amateur troupes. For a few silver pennies, the so-called Bartholomew birds could purchase mead and grilled pork pies, perhaps served by a comely tavern girl with a risque reputation. Such revelry no doubt provided a welcome escape from the drudgery and danger of medieval life. In an age when few could expect to see their 40th birthday, the promise of a few days of wine, laughter, and forgetting at the fair made the back-breaking labour in between seem almost worthwhile. And so, as our tryst with the wild and woolly world of medieval merriment draws to a close, one can't help but ponder what future generations might think of our own pastimes. Will scholars a millennium hence marvel at our fall football and pumpkin spice latte rituals? Puzzle over the allure of binge-watching prestige television? One thing is certain: the human need for diversion is as old as civilization itself. However technologies and fashions might shift, we remain a species deeply driven to amuse ourselves by any means necessary. So, as you drift off, soothed by these medieval revels recounted, this humble narrator wishes you a restful slumber, filled with visions of gallant knights and puckish jesters. If these tales of olden days brought a smile to your sleepy face, do consider hoisting a flagon in my honour with a like or subscribe. 'Twould be most heartily appreciated, my lords and ladies. And so, to sleep, perchance to dream of a time when iPhones were the stuff of sorcery, and the biggest influencer in the land was the Pope. Those were the days, my friend, we thought they'd never end. But end this evening's bedtime story must, leaving you to your well-earned medieval repose. Sweet dreams, fair listener, and fare thee well till next we meet.